I'm standing here in the town square of Manchester, Kentucky, looking at the Clay County Courthouse. On a quiet afternoon like this, it looks like any other seat of county government. But these bricks have seen more history and more blood than most battlefields. A Kentucky governor once called this place the bleeding wound of the state. And for over 50 years, this very spot was the heart of that wound. Here, where all you hear now is the wind in the trees, the silence was once shattered by a war between families that turned the rule of law into a bitter joke. Today, we're going to listen to the whispers from this place and piece together the story of how it all began. To understand the explosion, you first have to see the powder keg. Let's go back to 1844. Manchester, Kentucky wasn't much more than a collection of log and clapboard buildings around a courthouse, set against the vast green wilderness of the Cumberland Mountains. Life here was hard, governed by the seasons and the unwritten laws of kinship. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was worth more than his life. In this world, some names carried more weight than others, and no name carried more weight than Garrard. They were the closest thing Clay County had to royalty. The family patriarch, Theophilus T. Garrard, was a powerful statesman, a name known all the way in the capital. His son Daniel moved through these dusty streets with an air of absolute confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your family's power is the ultimate law of the land. Then there was Dr. Abner Baker. He was a man of two worlds. On one hand, he was a physician, a man of education and science in a place where folk remedies were still king. But he was also a man of Clay County, born and bred. His hands were just as calloused by the code of these hills as any farmer's, and his pride ran just as deep. He was respected, but he wasn't a Garrard, and in Clay County, that distinction mattered. The flashpoint between these two men wasn't some mythical silver mine, as the legends now claim. It was something far more practical and far more valuable, the local saltpeter works. In the 1840s, saltpeter was the key ingredient in gunpowder. Controlling it meant controlling the means for every man to hunt, to defend his home, to be self-reliant. It was power, pure and simple, and both Baker and Garrard wanted control. For months, their business dispute was a low rumble of thunder in the distance. You could feel it in the air of Manchester. The sideways glances in the general store, the conversations that stopped when one of them entered a room. Two proud men, their ambitions circling each other like wolves. The people of the town went about their lives, but they were watching. They knew the code. They knew that in these mountains, a storm can roll in without warning, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first crack of lightning. The stories passed down through generations are one thing, but sometimes you can find the cold, hard facts printed in black and white. Here, in the Clay County Historical Archives, I'm holding a digital copy of a newspaper clipping from a Lexington paper dated 1844. It's fragile, even as an image on a screen. The language is formal, a world away from our own. It describes the killing of Daniel Garrard not as a murder, but as an unfortunate and fatal affray. It speaks of the public shock and the immediate arrest of Dr. Abner Baker. But it's a small, almost overlooked detail in the third paragraph that truly matters. It mentions that Baker's defense team, some of the most expensive lawyers in the state, were preparing a novel argument, temporary insanity. This wasn't just a legal strategy. In a place like Clay County, where honor and accountability were everything, this was an insult. The idea that a man wasn't responsible for his actions, that he could kill the son of the most powerful man in the county and then hide behind a doctor's diagnosis, it was unthinkable. This piece of paper isn't just a news report. It's the official record of the moment the two sides stopped speaking the same language. One side started talking about the law, and the other was thinking only of justice. And that raised a critical question that would echo for decades. What happens when the law offers an escape, but the people demand a reckoning? That newspaper clipping only tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you how it felt on that hot, dusty day in Manchester. The argument between Dr. Baker and Daniel Garrard didn't start with a shout. It started as a low murmur in the middle of the street, two men standing toe to toe, the air crackling around them. The saltpeter works was the reason, but honor was the fuel. Voices rose with the heat of the day, and soon the whole town was watching from doorways and windows, silent witnesses to a prideful rage that was about to boil over. An insult was thrown. We'll never know the exact words, but in a place like this, a man's name is all he truly owns. Whatever was said, it was the point of no return. There was a flash of steel, a single, deafening crack that echoed off the clapboard storefronts, and Daniel Garrard fell to the ground. The son of the most powerful family in the county lay dead in the dust. In that moment, Dr. Abner Baker wasn't a man of medicine. He was just another Clay County man who had answered a perceived slight with finality. The law moved swiftly at first. Baker was arrested, and for a moment it seemed like the system would work. A trial, a verdict, a hanging. That was the expected order of things. But then, a new word began to filter through the mountains, a word that felt like a trick from a faraway city. Insanity. The Baker family, with its money, had hired lawyers who claimed the doctor hadn't known what he was doing, that his mind had snapped. To the Garrards, and to half of Clay County, this was a second, deeper wound. It was a declaration that a rich man's law could wash away a poor man's blood. It was a cowardly trick, a way to cheat the hangman, and more importantly, a way to cheat the code of the mountains. They saw it not as a legal defense, but as a profound act of disrespect to the dead and a challenge to the living. The seeds of conflict had been sown the moment Garrard fell, but this legal maneuver was the dark, fertile soil they needed to grow. The Garrard clan and their allies gathered on their porches and in their cabins, not to wait for a verdict from a judge, but to plan a reckoning. The official court had its own schedule, but in the hollows of Clay County, a different, older court was now in session, and it recognized only one sentence: blood for blood. Official records and old newspapers can give you the skeleton of a story, but the soul of it, the part that still beats, lives in the people who carry the memory. That's why I drove down a winding road deep into Clay County to a small house with a porch swing that's probably seen 100 years of summers. I came here to speak with a woman named Mary, the great-great-grandniece of Daniel Garrard. She is in her 80s, with eyes as clear as a mountain spring, and she holds the family's version of the story not as history, but as a living truth. We sat on that porch for an hour, the chains of the swing groaning a slow rhythm, before I even asked about the feud. She knew why I was there. She told me stories of her childhood, of hard winters and loving parents. And then she looked out toward the hills. "You want to know why they couldn't let it be?" she said. It wasn't a question. "My granddaddy told me what his father told him," she began, her voice steady. "When the news came that the Bakers were trying to get Abner off by claiming he was insane, it was like Daniel had been killed all over again. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about honor. To them, the Bakers were saying a Garrard's life was worth so little, you could take it and then just lie your way out of the consequences." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't just anger. It was a duty. They believed if they let Abner Baker live out his days after a stunt like that, the Garrard name would be a joke. Every man in the county would know that you could wrong them and get away with it. They felt they had no choice. The law had failed to give them justice, so the family had to. That single piece of family law, passed down through 5 generations, explains everything. It wasn't just an act of revenge they were planning. In their minds, it was an act of survival. Dr. Abner Baker was sent to the Eastern State Asylum in Lexington. To the outside world, this was the end of the matter. A killer, deemed insane, was safely locked away. But in the hollows of Clay County, it was seen as a temporary delay. The Garrards and their allies didn't see walls and doctors. They saw a debt that was still unpaid. They waited. Patience is a virtue carved into the people of these mountains, and they could wait for true justice as long as it took. For months, a tense, unnatural quiet settled over the county, the kind of stillness that comes before the deadliest of storms. Then, in 1845, the news came. It traveled by horseback and word of mouth, a spark landing in a field of dry tinder. Dr. Baker had escaped. He was coming home. To the Garrards, this was the ultimate act of defiance. The law had failed to punish him, and now it had failed to even contain him. He wasn't just a killer who had cheated justice. He was a ghost walking back into their lives, a living symbol of their family's dishonor. The time for waiting was over. There was no public call to arms. It happened quietly, with grim-faced men grabbing their long rifles from above the fireplace, nodding to their wives, and disappearing into the woods. This wasn't a mob. It was a posse, a self-appointed instrument of the only law they now recognized. They knew the trails, the creeks, and the hiding places better than any lawman from the city. They weren't hunting a fugitive. In their minds, they were escorting a man to the gallows that the state had been too cowardly to build. They found him. We don't know exactly where the ambush was laid, perhaps in a narrow hollow where the creek runs shallow, or along a ridge that offered a clear line of sight. But for Dr. Abner Baker, the journey home ended there. The deep silence of the Appalachian forest was shattered by a coordinated volley of rifle fire. It was swift, brutal, and final. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. Just the cold, hard arithmetic of the mountain code, a life for a life. This was the point of no return. The first killing had been a crime of passion, a dispute that ended in tragedy. This second killing was a calculated execution, a public statement written in gunpowder and blood. It was a declaration to all of Clay County and to the distant government in Frankfort that the official law had no authority here. The Garrards had reclaimed their family's honor, and in doing so, they had thrown down a gauntlet. Now, the Baker family and their allies had a blood debt of their own to repay. The feud was no longer a disagreement. It was an inheritance, and it would be passed down to the next generation with all its terrible weight. I'm back at the courthouse in Manchester, but this time, I'm looking closer. The afternoon sun is low, casting long shadows across the lawn. A building like this, over 100 years old, absorbs history. And if you run your hand along these old bricks, you're touching the last silent witness to the war's most violent chapter. This is the place where the feud stopped being a series of back-alley ambushes and became an open rebellion. They say if you look close enough at the stone pillars by the entrance, you can still find the chips and scars where bullets from a dozen different gunfights struck home. You have to imagine this lawn, not neatly trimmed, but churned to mud, filled with armed men loyal to the Howard clan. You have to picture those high windows, not with sunlight glinting off them, but barricaded from the inside with heavy oak desks and law books, with the glint of rifle barrels poking through the gaps. Because in 1898, this building wasn't a courthouse. It was a fortress, seized by Bad Tom Baker and his men. And right here, on this very lawn, the governor of Kentucky set up the state militia with a Gatling gun, a weapon of industrial warfare aimed at the heart of their own county seat. This is where it happened. The war came out of the shadows of the hollers and declared itself right here in the open. And on these very steps, years later, a final, fatal price would be paid. The feud didn't just smolder after the Civil War. It was forged into something harder, something colder. By the late 1890s, the fight was in the hands of a new generation, men who had grown up on stories of the first killings. On one side was Big Jim Howard, a man who could use a law book or a rifle with equal skill. On the other was the fearsome Bad Tom Baker, a one-armed Confederate veteran whose reputation was as hard as a coffin nail. The animosity between them finally reached its breaking point when Howard, using his political influence, began to stack the legal system against the Baker clan. Feeling the walls of the law closing in, Tom Baker made a decision that would stun the entire state. He would take the law itself hostage. In 1898, he and his heavily armed followers marched into Manchester, not as citizens, but as an occupying army. They stormed the courthouse, drove out the officials, and barricaded the doors. The seat of county justice was now the fortress of a clan warlord. From the second-story windows, the glint of rifle barrels sent a clear message to Jim Howard and his allies. The time for legal tricks was over. This would be settled with gunpowder. Manchester became a ghost town. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The only sounds were the scraping of boots on gravel and the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle shot that would echo through the empty streets, followed by an even more terrifying silence. A spider web of cracks would appear in a storefront window. A horse tied to a post would suddenly fall, its quiet death a warning to anyone who dared to show themselves. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension and the smell of stale tobacco smoke. Tom Baker, his one arm as steady as iron, directed his men, their faces grim in the dusty shafts of light filtering through the barricades. The standoff dragged on for days. The news of a county courthouse under siege by its own citizens reached the governor's mansion in Frankfort. It was an embarrassment, an open sore on the face of Kentucky. Governor William O. Bradley declared Clay County to be in a state of insurrection. He called it the bleeding wound of the state, and he decided to cauterize it with force. The arrival of the state militia was a sight no one in Manchester would ever forget. Uniformed soldiers marching in formation, followed by a wagon carrying a weapon of modern war, a Gatling gun. They set it up on the courthouse lawn, its brass casings gleaming in the sun, its multiple barrels aimed squarely at the front doors. This was no longer a family feud. This was a rebellion. The government of Kentucky was prepared to mow down its own citizens to restore order. The air grew heavy, silent. Inside, the Baker clan looked out at the machine gun, a weapon that could tear through their wooden barricades like paper. Outside, the militia commander stared at the courthouse, knowing the order to fire would result in a slaughter. This was the heart of darkness, a moment when all pretense of civilization had vanished, leaving only two armed camps separated by 100 yards of lawn and 50 years of hate. The siege didn't end with the roar of the Gatling gun. It ended with a quiet, cold calculation. Tom Baker, for all his fury, was not a fool. He saw the inevitable. The doors to the courthouse eventually swung open, and the Baker clan walked out, laying down their weapons. But it wasn't a surrender. Their eyes, burning with defiance, promised that this was only a pause. The state had taken back its building, but the war for Clay County was far from over. The bleeding had been stopped for a moment, but the wound was now deeper than ever. After the soldiers and the Gatling gun went home, the war moved from the courthouse lawn back into the courthouse itself. The weapons were no longer rifles, but pieces of paper, and I'm looking at one of them right now. This is a copy of the official indictment brought against Bad Tom Baker and his men following the siege. The script is formal, the ink faded, the language cold and precise. It lists the charges in stark legal terms: armed insurrection, sedition, conspiracy to intimidate an officer of the law. On paper, it paints a simple picture of a band of outlaws who tried to overthrow the government. It's neat, it's clean, and it's a masterclass in how history is written by the winners. But reading this is like reading a doctor's report that lists the cause of death as cessation of heartbeat. It's technically true, but it tells you nothing of the disease that ravaged the body for years. This document has no lines for the 50 years of bad blood. It doesn't mention the political machinations of the Howard clan or the deep-seated belief that a Baker couldn't get a fair hearing in that very building. The paper simply lists the crime. It completely erases the reason. It reduces a multi-generational war down to a few sterile legal phrases, stripping away all the honor, the rage, and the grief that led those men to make their stand. And with this document, the full weight of the state's power was about to come crashing down on the Baker clan. With the Gatling gun gone and the militia back in their barracks, a different kind of army descended on Clay County. This one wore suits and carried leather briefcases filled with law books. The state of Kentucky was determined to make an example of Bad Tom Baker. This wouldn't be a local trial with a jury of neighbors. This was the full weight of the Commonwealth coming down on one man. The trial was a spectacle. The Manchester courthouse, the very building Tom Baker had held as a fortress, was now his cage. Every day, the courtroom was packed to the rafters, a silent, divided sea of humanity. On one side sat the friends and family of the Baker clan, their faces set like stone. On the other side sat the allies of Big Jim Howard, their expressions a mixture of triumph and anticipation. Howard himself was often there, a quiet, imposing figure in the back, watching the slow, methodical destruction of his great rival. You could feel the hate in the air, so thick you could choke on it. Tom Baker sat at the defendant's table, his one arm resting motionless. He was a lion in a cage, a creature of the open ridges and wild hollows, now trapped by legal arguments and procedural rules he neither understood nor respected. The state's prosecutors painted him as a traitor, a revolutionary who had spit in the face of the law. His defense argued he was a man pushed to the brink, a citizen who had only occupied the courthouse because he knew he could never get justice within its walls. An argument that was, in its own way, a damning confession that the system was broken. The jury listened, their faces pale. They were local men, and they knew that whatever verdict they delivered, they would have to live with the consequences. They were judging not just Tom Baker, but the future of Clay County. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The state had been humiliated, and someone had to pay. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the room fell into a dead silence. The word guilty was spoken quietly, but it landed like a hammer blow. Tom Baker didn't flinch. He didn't rage or despair. He simply looked across the room, his gaze locking onto Jim Howard. In that one look, a lifetime of hatred was exchanged. The law had finally put Bad Tom Baker behind bars. But everyone in that room knew that a jail cell could hold the man, but it could never contain the feud. The law had won its battle, but in doing so, it had only ensured the war would continue. Up on a hill overlooking Manchester, there's a quiet cemetery where the wind rustles through the leaves of ancient oak trees. The tombstones are a library of endings, some new and polished, others old and leaning, their names almost erased by a century of rain and frost. This is where all the fury and ambition of the Clay County War finally came to rest. And this is where you find them. Over here is the grave of Bad Tom Baker. It's a simple military-style stone befitting a Confederate soldier. It lists his name, his company, and his dates. There are no grand pronouncements, just the hard, simple facts of a life that ended. His family still tends to it. A small flag flutters here on Memorial Days. It's a place of quiet, defiant dignity. And then, you walk just 100 yards or so past a few other families, and you find the marker for James Big Jim Howard. It's a bit more substantial, a testament to a man of property and political power. He lies here surrounded by his own kin. They lie so close now, these two great enemies. For decades, they were the twin poles of a war that tore this county apart, and now they're silent neighbors in the same Kentucky soil. All that rage, all that blood, all that power, reduced to two names carved in granite, slowly fading under the Appalachian sun. Seeing them here, you'd think the story ended with Tom Baker's conviction. But a prison sentence wasn't the final chapter. The Mountain Code had one last bill to collect, and the story of how both these men ended up on this hill is the feud's last and most bitter reckoning. With Bad Tom Baker locked away in the Frankfort Penitentiary, a strange and fragile peace settled over Clay County. For the first time in decades, Big Jim Howard was the undisputed king. He had won. He had used the law, the militia, and the courts to do what generations of his family couldn't do with rifles. He had broken the power of the Baker clan. For a few years, it seemed the war was finally over, ended not with a bang, but with the clang of a prison gate. But the politics of Kentucky have always been a blood sport. In 1899, the state was ripped apart by the most violent and disputed gubernatorial election in its history. When the Democrat William Goebel was assassinated in Frankfort in 1900, the state teetered on the brink of its own civil war. A massive investigation was launched, and a net was cast for anyone with a reputation for political violence. And in one of history's cruelest twists, the master of the law, Big Jim Howard, found himself caught in its web. He was accused of being a conspirator in the plot to kill the governor. The trial was a statewide sensation. Jim Howard, the man who had so skillfully used the courts against Tom Baker, now faced a jury with his own life on the line. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The great victor of the Clay County War was now a prisoner himself. And then, the feud delivered its final, bitter irony. The same political chaos that had condemned Jim Howard miraculously set his old enemy free. The new governor, in a flurry of politically motivated pardons, granted clemency to many men, including the aging, one-armed insurrectionist from Clay County. Bad Tom Baker walked out of prison a free man. So, by 1901, the chessboard had been reset for one final terrible move. Jim Howard, through his own powerful connections, soon secured a pardon as well. Both old lions were back in the same territory. Baker was now an old man, perhaps believing the feud had died with their mutual imprisonment. Howard was also old, but he was a man who had been publicly shamed and imprisoned, and he had one last debt to settle. The long shadow of the feud had stretched across 57 years, and it was about to fall one last time, right back where it all began, in the streets of Manchester. Even now, more than a century after the last shot was fired, the Clay County War isn't a settled matter here. It isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a living memory, a story that gets told on front porches and at family reunions, and the version you hear depends entirely on which family is telling it. The names Baker and Howard don't just belong to the dead. They belong to the living, and they still carry the weight of that old, bitter argument. To this day, if you talk to folks whose ancestors stood with Tom Baker, you'll hear the story of a hero. They'll tell you, Bad Tom was a man of the people, a proud Confederate soldier who stood up to a corrupt political machine run by the wealthy and powerful Howard family. They'll say the courthouse siege wasn't insurrection. It was a desperate man's only way to demand a justice he could never get from a bought and paid for judge. In their version, Tom Baker was a man of honor who was assassinated in cold blood, a victim of a coward's bullet because his enemies could never face him in a fair fight. But then, you drive a few miles down the road and ask a family whose great-grandfather rode with Jim Howard, and you'll get a different truth entirely. They'll tell you Big Jim Howard was the law. He was a sheriff, a leader, a man trying to drag a wild and violent county into the modern age. To them, Bad Tom Baker was a ruthless outlaw, a violent thug who thought he was above the law and terrorized anyone who stood against him. The courthouse siege was an act of treason, an attack on civilization itself. And his death on the courthouse steps. That wasn't an assassination. It was an execution, the long overdue end for a man who had lived by the gun. So which one is the truth? Was Tom Baker a folk hero or a homegrown terrorist? Was Jim Howard a civic leader or a political boss who used the law like a club? The honest answer is that after 100 years, the truth is a matter of blood and memory. The facts are a pile of dry bones, and it's the families that put the flesh and spirit back on them. The war is over, but the argument about who was right, who was wrong, and who deserved what they got, that argument will probably never end. When the shooting finally stops and the last of the warlords are in the ground, a story enters a new phase of its life. The hard, jagged facts of who did what to whom begin to get smoothed over by time, like a stone in a fast-running creek. History becomes folklore. The Clay County War was too big, too bloody, and too long for people to simply file away. They had to make sense of it, to turn the sheer brutal chaos into a lesson, or a warning, or a ghost. Ask around Manchester today, especially among the older folks, and you might hear a story told in a hushed voice on a dark autumn night. They say that if you stand near the courthouse when the streets are empty and quiet, you can sometimes see a shadow moving on the steps where Bad Tom Baker fell. A tall, lonely figure with one empty sleeve that seems to sway in a breeze that no one else can feel. They say he's still waiting, still looking for the man who shot him, or perhaps for a kind of justice he never found inside that building. It's more than just a ghost story. The feud lives on as a cautionary tale, a lesson that became woven into the fabric of the community. It's the story a father would tell a hot-headed son to warn him about the poison of carrying a grudge. Remember the Bakers and the Howards, he'd say. They fought for so long, they forgot what they were even fighting about, and all they earned was a piece of land on Cemetery Hill. The war became a local proverb, a dark piece of wisdom paid for with generations of blood. This is how a community processes a trauma this deep. The specific details of the legal disputes and the political maneuvers fade away. What remains is a powerful myth, a story of two families locked in a death spiral, a one-armed ghost who haunts the seat of justice, and a bloody warning that echoes down through the years. The facts belong to the archives, but the legend belongs to the mountains. So here I am again, back on the square in Manchester, looking at the same courthouse as the day begins to fade. But I'm not seeing it the same way. It's no longer just an old brick building. I can almost see the shadow of Daniel Garrard falling in the dust, feel the tension of the siege with Tom Baker's men peering from the windows, and hear the echo of that final fatal shot on these very steps. We came here to listen to the whispers of this place, and what we heard was a 57-year-long scream. The Clay County War is a story about how honor, when it turns to pride, can become a prison. It's about how revenge can become a family's only inheritance. It's a hard lesson written in blood that shows how easily the law can be broken and how much harder it is to put back together. It proves that the most dangerous place on earth can be the few miles between your neighbor's house and your own when a grudge is on the line. The next time you pass a quiet courthouse on a sleepy town square, remember this one. Remember what these bricks have seen and the price that was paid right here. The men are gone. The guns are silent. The bleeding wound has finally scarred over, but the story remains. The newspapers called it the Fratterville mine disaster. A tragic number etched in history. 216 men and boys gone in an instant. But numbers are cold, and they can't tell you the real story. They can't describe what it's like to sit in absolute darkness, hundreds of feet underground, listening to the air run out as you write a final letter to your wife. They can't make you feel the horror of a father holding his dying son on his lap. They say it was an accident. But the true story of Fratterville isn't about the explosion that shook the earth. It's about what happened after, in the suffocating silence. Today, we're not just telling a story. We're going to listen to the voices of the dead, reading the last words they scratched onto paper from inside their own tomb. Imagine Fratterville, Tennessee, on the morning of May 19th, 1902. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of wooden houses clinging to the hillsides, all painted the same color by the company, all breathing the same coal-tinged air. Life here was simple and hard, governed by the rising of the sun and the shriek of the mine whistle. The mountains of Coal Creek weren't just a backdrop. They were the provider and the master. giving families their daily bread from the dark seams of coal hidden in their belly. In these small homes, a familiar ritual played out before dawn. Wives rose in the dim light to stoke the fire and cook breakfast, the smell of biscuits and coffee mingling with the ever-present scent of coal dust. Men pulled on their stiff work clothes, their faces already smudged with the shadow of their trade. These were the moments that made up a life. A quick kiss goodbye at the door, a hand ruffling a child's hair, a promise to be home for supper. For the men of Frateville, descending into the earth was as natural as breathing. Among them was Jacob Vowell, a 47-year-old man with the steady hands and quiet dignity of a veteran miner. He was a family man, respected in the community. Walking beside him was his 14-year-old son, Elbert. In those days, boys became men in the darkness of the mines, learning the dangerous trade from their fathers. For Elbert, working alongside his dad wasn't just a job. It was a rite of passage, a step into the world of men. They were part of a brotherhood of 216 souls that morning. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons, some boys no older than Elbert. They walked together toward the gaping mouth of the mine, their lunch pails clanking, their carbide lamps not yet lit. The air was cool, the sky was beginning to lighten, and the world above ground was waking up to a beautiful spring day. There was no sense of doom, no premonition of what was to come. It was just another Monday. They stepped onto the man trip, the string of open cars that would carry them down the sloping shaft into the heart of the mountain. The journey into the darkness was a daily routine, the familiar rumble of the wheels a mundane soundtrack to their lives. They joked and talked, their voices echoing briefly before being swallowed by the immense, earthy silence of the deep. But the mountain they trusted was holding a secret. Deep within the labyrinthine tunnels, a pocket of methane gas, odorless and invisible, was seeping from the coal seam. It was a time bomb, silently counting down. Every foot the men traveled deeper into the earth brought them closer to the moment when their ordinary world would be torn apart by a roar from hell itself. Deep inside the earth, the men worked in the flickering glow of their carbide lamps. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and coal. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of shovels against rock and the metallic ring of pickaxes striking the black seam. And then, in one of the far-flung tunnels, it happened. A miner's open flame, the very tool that let him see in the dark, touched a pocket of invisible methane gas. In that single fatal instant, the air itself caught fire. The explosion wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, a giant fist that punched through the mine's narrow arteries. It ignited the fine, suspended coal dust, creating a secondary, even more powerful blast that ripped through the tunnels at the speed of sound. A wave of fire and pressure shot outwards, snuffing out lamps and lives without distinction. For the men caught in its path, there was no time to scream. The world simply ceased to exist. On the surface, at 7:20 in the morning, the ground trembled as if a beast had woken from a long slumber. A deep, guttural roar erupted from the mouth of the mine, a sound that rattled windows and shook the very souls of the people in Frateville. It was followed by a geyser of black smoke, splintered timbers, and mangled machinery that shot hundreds of feet into the sky. The mine, the town's source of life, was now breathing fire and death. Within moments, the routine of the morning was shattered by screams. Wives and children, their faces masks of terror, ran toward the mine entrance. But what they found was a vision from hell. The wooden structures of the tipple were engulfed in flames, and a thick, choking smoke billowed from the shaft, blocking any hope of entry. The force of the blast had not only sealed the entrance, it had destroyed the mine's massive ventilation fan. The lungs of the mountain had been ripped out. Deep inside, in the furthest reaches of the mine where the blast hadn't reached, a few dozen men were thrown to the ground. Their lamps were extinguished, plunging them into a darkness more profound than any they had ever known. The air thrummed, and then an unearthly silence fell. They were alive, but they were cut off. The air they were breathing was now a finite resource, a dwindling supply in a sealed stone coffin. The clock on their survival had begun to tick. In the absolute blackness, the survivors gathered. The thunder of the explosion had faded, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. The air, once merely damp and earthy, now carried a new taste, sharp and metallic. It was the taste of afterdamp, the poisonous cocktail of gases left behind by the blast. They knew what it meant. There would be no rescue. Death wasn't coming for them with fire and fury. It was seeping toward them, silent and invisible. In this moment, faced with the end, Jacob Vowell became their anchor. He didn't preach hope where there was none. Instead, he offered them a final defiant purpose. He told any man with a pencil and a scrap of paper to write. Write to their wives, their children, their mothers. Write the words they would never get to say. In the suffocating darkness of their tomb, these men, whose hands were calloused from swinging a pickaxe, began the delicate work of writing their last goodbyes. Imagine the scene. A handful of dying carbide lamps cast a ghostly flickering glow, creating dancing shadows on the coal-black walls. The only sounds were the ragged coughing of men fighting for each breath and the soft, steady scratch of pencil lead on paper. Men leaned against the cold rock, trying to steady their hands, pouring a lifetime of love onto a few precious inches of paper. They weren't writing about death. They were writing about life, about the families waiting for them under a sun they would never see again. Jacob Vowell wrote to his Sarah, his words a simple, heartbreaking testament. Tell my little boys to be good boys and to trust in the Lord. He was a father to the very end. Beside him, his 14-year-old son Elbert, his strength failing, lay his head in his father's lap. In the dimming light, Jacob watched his son's breathing grow shallow, watched him drift into a sleep from which he would not wake. Then, with a hand that must have trembled, Jacob Vowell made one last entry in the margins of his letter. He didn't describe the horror. He wrote a sentence of pure, devastating fact. My boy Elbert has gone to sleep. He has been dead for a few minutes. It was a final act of a father recording his son's peaceful passage, a final whisper of love in a world that had turned to black. One by one, the lamps sputtered and died, plunging the chamber into a darkness that was total. The scratching of pencils ceased. The ragged breaths grew fainter, until at last there was only silence. On the bodies of the dead, pocket watches continued to tick for a few minutes more before they, too, stopped, their hands frozen on the final moment when the last bit of life-giving air was gone from the room. For 3 long days, Fraterville held its breath. The fire at the mine entrance was eventually smothered, but the mountain remained a sealed tomb. On the surface, a grim vigil of hope against reason took hold. Wives and mothers stood in small, silent groups, their eyes fixed on the smoking hole in the ground that had swallowed their world. The company brought in experts and rescue teams, made up of miners from neighboring towns, worked tirelessly, risking their own lives with every step they took into the poisoned darkness. The air inside was a killer, silent and patient. Rescuers had to work in short, desperate bursts, clearing rubble and shoring up collapsed tunnels, all while battling the suffocating afterdamp. With each foot they gained, the hope of finding anyone alive dwindled, replaced by the grim determination to at least bring the men home for a proper burial. They found the first bodies near the entrance, victims of the blast's initial violent fury. But the deeper they went, the more the destruction gave way to an eerie, undisturbed silence. Finally, they reached the crude barricade of rock and clothing. They knew men were behind it. Carefully, they dismantled the wall, stone by stone. The first beam of a rescuer's lamp cut through the darkness and fell upon a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 26 men were lying on the ground. There was no sign of a struggle, no panic. They looked as if they had simply laid down to rest, many with their arms around each other in a final brotherly embrace. And then they saw the letters, tucked into pockets, clutched in hands, or placed carefully on their chests, were the final messages from the dark. As the bodies were solemnly carried out into the daylight, the news of the letters spread through the grieving crowd like a whisper. This tragedy now had a voice. These were not just numbers in a death toll, they were husbands and fathers who had spent their final moments thinking only of love. Fratterville had become a town of widows and orphans overnight. They say there weren't enough coffins in the county, and they had to be shipped in by the trainload, a final, heartbreaking measure of the town's immeasurable loss. There was no villain in a black hat to put on trial. There was only a company, a mountain, and 216 fresh graves. But the law demanded an answer, so a coroner's inquest was convened. It wasn't a grand trial in a stone courthouse. It was a proceeding held in the shadow of the disaster, a formal attempt to write the final chapter in the official record. For the widows of Fratterville, it was a desperate, flickering hope for accountability. For the Coal Creek Coal Company, it was a matter of containing the damage. Company officials and their lawyers spoke in measured tones. They offered condolences and expressed deep regret. They spoke of the inherent dangers of mining, of the unpredictable nature of the earth. The explosion, they argued, was a tragic accident, an act of God that no one could have foreseen or prevented. They presented charts and testimony from their own experts, painting a picture of a well-run operation that had simply fallen victim to a terrible misfortune. Against this polished defense, who was there to speak for the dead? The miners' letters were their final testimony, but they were testaments of love, not of legal negligence. The living miners in the community, the ones who would need a job when the grief subsided, knew better than to speak out against the only employer in town. To accuse the company was to risk your own family's survival. So they stayed silent, their anger and their knowledge of the mine's gassy reputation a heavy, unspoken secret in the room. The verdict, when it came, was as cold and hard as a seam of coal. The coroner's jury concluded that the miners had died from an explosion of methane gas and coal dust ignited by an open flame. But crucially, they assigned no legal blame. No charges were filed. The company was officially cleared of any criminal negligence. They offered recommendations for the future, the use of safer lamps, better ventilation, but these were suggestions, not punishments. Was this justice? The law of men, the formal system of courts and inquests, had spoken. It had rendered its verdict in clean, legal terms. The company was not a murderer, but a victim of circumstance. But for the people of Fratterville, for the women who now had to raise their children alone, the verdict was just another form of violence. It was a confirmation that the lives of their husbands and sons were worth less than the cost of implementing stricter safety measures. The company walked away free, ready to rebuild and reopen the mine. The town, however, was handed a life sentence of loss and unanswered questions. The inquest provided an official cause of death, but it offered no comfort and no justice. It was a quiet, brutal lesson in the way the world worked in 1902. The law protected property and profit, while the mountains kept the men. The town of Fratterville never recovered. It couldn't. How does a town built around 216 men continue to exist when they are all gone? It became a town of shadows, a community of widows and orphans, where the sound of the mine whistle was replaced by a profound and lasting silence. In time, families moved away, houses fell into disrepair, and Fratterville, the bustling coal town, slowly faded from the map, becoming little more than a name in a history book. But the story didn't vanish completely. It's carved in stone. If you know where to look, you can still find the Leech Cemetery. There, in a large grassy circle, lie the graves of many of the miners. It's known as the Fratterville Miners' Circle, a silent, circular monument to a shared fate. Walking among the headstones is a chilling experience. Name after name, all followed by the same date of death, May 19th, 1902. It's a physical ledger of the price paid for coal. And yet, the most powerful trace of that day isn't made of stone. It's made of paper and pencil lead. The letters, Jacob Vowell's final words to his Sarah, Eugene Daniels's prayer for his children, they survived. They were carefully passed down, preserved in archives and museums, their faded script a direct line to the heart of the tragedy. They are not just historical artifacts, they are sacred relics. When you read them, you are no longer a spectator to history. You are in that darkness with them, listening to the very last words of men who knew they were about to die. The mine itself is long gone, its entrance sealed over, reclaimed by the patient green of the mountains. Most people who drive those Tennessee roads today have no idea they're passing a place where an American tragedy unfolded. But the mountains remember. They hold the silence of that sealed-off tunnel, the weight of the grief that soaked into this soil. They remember the roar, the smoke, and the long, agonizing wait that followed. And they hold the echoes of the last words scratched out in the dark, a story of love that proved stronger than the stone that entombed it. So we return to the question we started with. What really happened in the Fratterville mine? An explosion killed 216 men. That is the fact. But it is not the truth. The truth is that in the final suffocating moments of their lives, a handful of ordinary men faced the end not with rage or panic, but with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. They chose to spend their last ounce of life and breath not on themselves, but on sending one last message of love out of the darkness. The Fratterville disaster is a story of industrial negligence, a brutal lesson paid for in blood that would slowly, painfully lead to safer mines for future generations. But its truest legacy is not found in safety regulations. It's a lesson in what matters at the very end of everything. It teaches us that the human spirit, when stripped of all else, will reach for connection, for family, for love. In the blackest pit, these men found a light inside themselves and sent it outward. Their bodies were buried in the Tennessee earth over a century ago, their towns swallowed by time. But their final words, scratched onto scraps of paper, have traveled through the years to find us. The mountain took their lives, but it could not silence their love. It couldn't bury their story. On the morning of March 20th, 1906, the modern steel of the Walnut Street Bridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was host to a medieval horror. Dangling from a thick rope tied to a girder was the body of a man riddled with bullet holes, a silent silhouette against the rising sun. This wasn't a secret crime, hidden in the shadows. This was a public spectacle, a brutal message left for the entire city and the entire nation to see. The victim was a man named Ed Johnson, and just hours before his death, he had been granted a stay of execution by the United States Supreme Court. He was, by law, under federal protection. So what happened on that bridge? How could a mob tear a man from his cell and lynch him in open defiance of the highest court in the land? Today, we will answer that question. We will unravel a story of a city's rage, a sheriff's betrayal, and an injustice so profound it sparked an unprecedented legal battle for the very soul of America. Before he was a name in a Supreme Court case, Ed Johnson was just a man trying to find his way. He was 24 years old, a handyman, and a member of the Second Baptist Church. He wasn't a troublemaker. By all accounts, he was quiet, unassuming, and known for his steady work. In the segregated world of 1906 Chattanooga, a city trying to brand itself as a progressive hub of the New South, men like Ed Johnson lived a precarious existence. They were the backbone of the city's labor force, yet they were afforded none of its protections, and lived under the constant unspoken threat of a racial hierarchy enforced by both law and tradition. His world was one of separate entrances, separate water fountains, and a carefully maintained social distance. He had hopes and fears like any other man, but his were filtered through the lens of Jim Crow. He sought stability, a bit of peace, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived within the narrow confines society had drawn for him. He was, in short, an ordinary man, which made him the perfect blank canvas onto which a city could project its deepest fears and hatreds. Miles away, in another part of that same city, lived Nevada Taylor. She was a young white woman, and her world was the mirror opposite of Ed Johnson's, defined by a different set of rigid expectations. Her life was meant to be one of protected virtue, of church socials, and a future promised within the safe confines of her community. She was a symbol of the Southern purity that the white power structure was obsessed with defending. The city they both called home, Chattanooga, was a place of deep contradictions. It boasted of its industry, its economic growth, and the grand Walnut Street Bridge that stitched the city together over the Tennessee River. But beneath this veneer of progress was a simmering cauldron of racial animosity. The memory of the Civil War was still fresh, and the rigid social order of the Jim Crow South was considered sacred. The slightest perceived transgression against that order, especially the ultimate taboo of a black man being accused of harming a white woman, was enough to make the city's civilized facade crumble into dust. In this tinderbox, Ed Johnson and Nevada Taylor were strangers, their lives running on parallel tracks that were never meant to intersect. But on a cold January night, in the darkness of a cemetery on the edge of town, those tracks would collide in a catastrophic event. One of them would become the victim of a brutal assault, and the other the victim of a city's ravenous, indiscriminate rage. Both of their lives and the world they knew were about to be destroyed. The crime scene was not a room with four walls, but a sprawling, cold expanse of earth and stone, the Forest Hills Cemetery. By day, it was a place of quiet reflection, but on the night of January 23, 1906, this sanctuary for the dead became a stage for a living nightmare. The air was still, the only sounds the rustle of winter leaves and the distant whistle of a train. It was in this profound and unnerving silence that Nevada Taylor was found, terrified and disoriented. There was no physical evidence to speak of, no footprints that could be trusted on the hard, cold ground, no discarded weapon, no clear signs of a struggle that told a specific story. The only evidence was Nevada Taylor's own harrowing account, a story pieced together from the fragments of trauma and the blackness of the night. She couldn't see her attacker's face. She couldn't describe his clothes. All she could offer was a voice in the dark and the terrifying assertion that her assailant was a black man. From the chaos, investigators clung to a single flimsy piece of information. Miss Taylor mentioned that she had grabbed at something during the attack, a small leather strap, which she thought might have come from her assailant's weapon. This tiny, ambiguous detail became the cornerstone of the entire investigation. It was not a clue that pointed to a specific person, but a desperate anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The scene of the crime quickly expanded beyond the cemetery gates and into the very heart of Chattanooga. Whispers turned to shouts, and fear curdled into rage. The city's white populace didn't see a mystery to be solved. They saw an outrage to be avenged. The lack of a clear suspect didn't inspire caution. Instead, it created a vacuum that was instantly filled with suspicion directed at every black man in the city. The investigation began not with a question, who did this, but with a conclusion. A black man was responsible, and he would be found. The wilderness of the cemetery had offered no easy answers, but the mob-minded certainty of the city demanded one, and it demanded one immediately. The hunt was on, not for a specific individual, but for any man who could be made to fit the crime. The city's fury needed a face, a name to attach to its collective rage. That pressure fell squarely on the shoulders of Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. A man of his time and place, Shipp understood that justice in the Jim Crow South was often secondary to maintaining order, and order meant placating the white majority. His personal vendetta wasn't against any one man, but against the threat of chaos and the political damage an unsolved crime of this nature could do to his career. He needed a culprit, and he needed one fast. The investigation became a brutal dragnet. Deputies swept through the black neighborhoods of Chattanooga, rounding up men by the dozen. It wasn't about finding clues. It was about creating a lineup of potential sacrifices. And in this trawl, they found Ed Johnson. He wasn't caught red-handed, nor was he found with any incriminating evidence. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a known figure in the community who suddenly found himself ensnared in a nightmare. The flimsy clue of the leather strap was now given a purpose. A rumor began to circulate, likely started by the authorities themselves, that Johnson had been seen with a similar strap. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Suddenly, the community had something to latch onto. Ed Johnson fit the profile not because of evidence, but because he was available. He was a black man, he was young, and he was powerless. The entire weight of the investigation now shifted onto him. Every aspect of his quiet life was re-examined through a lens of presumed guilt. His unassuming nature was twisted into sullen secrecy, his work as a handyman seen as a cover for a darker character. The community didn't have a motive rooted in personal animosity, so they invented one for him. The racist, monstrous caricature of a black man driven by uncontrollable lust. A vile stereotype used for a century to justify racial violence. The mob had its villain. The Whispers had found their target. In the face of a lynch mob and a hostile legal system, a man has one last line of defense: his own lawyers. They are supposed to be his sword and his shield, the one party in the room bound by oath to fight for him, no matter the odds. For Ed Johnson, this sacred trust was placed in the hands of two court-appointed attorneys, W.G.M. Thomas and Robert Cameron. But this is where the story takes a chilling turn. The deepest betrayal wouldn't come from the mob in the streets, but from the very men sitting beside him at the defense table. There was no hidden affair or secret greed driving these men. Their motive was something far more common and far more poisonous. They simply did not believe their client was innocent. They were products of their time, white men of standing in a society that had already condemned Ed Johnson in its heart. To them, defending him was not a pursuit of justice, but an unpleasant professional obligation. A vigorous defense would mean alienating their peers, the judges, and the entire white community of Chattanooga. It was a battle they had no intention of fighting. Their actions in the courtroom, when re-examined, tell a story not of a failed defense, but of a defense that was never truly mounted. They met with Johnson only once, for a few minutes, before the trial began. They called no witnesses to the stand to testify to his character or to help establish an alibi. They offered only a timid, half-hearted cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses. The trial was a sham, and his own lawyers were willing participants in the charade. The final, damning proof of their betrayal came after the inevitable guilty verdict was handed down. Ed Johnson, terrified but resolute in his innocence, begged them to file an appeal. They refused. In their eyes, the case was closed. They had performed their duty as they saw it, and now they were washing their hands of the condemned man. This wasn't just legal malpractice, it was an act of profound abandonment. Ed Johnson's supposed guardians had delivered him, bound and gagged, to his executioners. He was utterly and completely alone. Just when Ed Johnson's fate seemed sealed, a new and unexpected force entered the fray. It did not come from within Chattanooga's white power structure, but from outside of it, from a quarter no one had bothered to consider. Two local black attorneys, Noah Pardon and Stiles Hutchins, stepped out of the shadows. This was not just a legal maneuver, it was an act of almost unimaginable courage. In a city where they were considered second-class citizens, where their very ambition was seen as a provocation, they chose to stand up for a man everyone else had left for dead. Their motive was not profit or personal gain. It was a radical belief in the promise of American justice, even when America itself had broken that promise time and time again. They saw a sham trial, an innocent man railroaded, and a violation of the most basic constitutional rights. Their interest clashed directly with the unwritten law of the city, which demanded a swift execution to satisfy the mob. Pardon and Hutchins were not just fighting for Ed Johnson, they were challenging the entire corrupt edifice of Jim Crow justice. Their presence created an immediate and dangerous unease. They were threatened, intimidated, and ostracized. But they refused to back down. When the Tennessee Supreme Court slammed its doors in their face, they made a decision that would change legal history. They decided to appeal to an authority far outside the state, a power that the Chattanooga mob could not control, the Supreme Court of the United States. This was the ultimate external threat. The news that two black lawyers were taking their case to Washington, D.C. was seen as an outrageous act of defiance. To Sheriff Shipp and the city's leaders, this wasn't an appeal. It was an invasion. It was the federal government, the same force that had crushed the Confederacy 40 years prior, once again threatening to meddle in their affairs. The conflict was no longer just about Ed Johnson. It was a battle for control, a struggle between local mob rule and the supreme law of the land. The entire official investigation into the assault of Nevada Taylor was, from the very beginning, a grand and tragic false trail. The objective was never to find the truth, but to secure a conviction. The so-called clues that led to Ed Johnson were not discoveries, but constructions, red herrings deliberately laid to guide public opinion toward a predetermined conclusion. The central piece of evidence, the small leather strap, was the most potent of these fictions. Investigators treated it like a smoking gun, a direct link to Johnson, despite the fact that no one could ever definitively prove it belonged to him or that it was even connected to the crime. The trail led from this flimsy object to the Hamilton County Jail, where the most crucial piece of misdirection was staged. The identification of Ed Johnson by Nevada Taylor was not a moment of clarity, but of manufactured certainty. She was brought into a dim room where Johnson was the only suspect presented. Her initial hesitation, her uncertainty, was brushed aside by the forceful suggestions of the lawmen around her. Under immense pressure, she gave them the identification they wanted. This shaky, coerced statement, which should have been a dead end, was instead treated as an irrefutable fact. Meanwhile, any path that might have led to the truth was quickly blocked off. Ed Johnson had an alibi. Witnesses in the black community could place him at a saloon far from the cemetery at the time of the attack. But these leads, the only ones that actually pointed toward his innocence, were never pursued. The authorities simply weren't interested. Every testament to Johnson's good character, every inconsistency in the timeline, was ignored. These promising trails didn't evaporate. They were deliberately buried under the weight of the official narrative. This created a strange and dangerous kind of frustration. For Sheriff Shipp and the white mob, the frustration wasn't that the case was stalled, but that the legal process, however flawed, was taking too long. They had their man, their simple answer, and the appeals filed by Pardon and Hutchins were seen as infuriating obstacles. For the black community, the feeling was one of growing terror. They were watching a legal system actively lead itself down a false path, and they knew that at the end of this trail lay not justice, but a hangman's noose for an innocent man. In Chattanooga, the truth was not buried by a lack of evidence, but by two formidable walls of silence. The first was a wall built by the white community, not of quiet whispers, but of a deafening, unified roar. It was an unspoken agreement that Ed Johnson was guilty, a conclusion reached before the trial even began. This wasn't just about one crime, it was about defending a fragile social order. To question Johnson's guilt was to question the very foundation of their world, to suggest a white woman could be wrong and a black man could be innocent. Any white person who harbored doubts learned quickly to keep them to themselves, lest they be branded a sympathizer, a traitor to their own. The second wall was built by the black community, and it was a wall of pure, unadulterated terror. People knew Ed Johnson. They knew his character. Some even knew where he was on that fateful night. But the code of the Jim Crow South was brutally simple. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and you knew nothing that contradicted the white mob. To come forward as an alibi witness for Johnson would not have been seen as a civic duty, but as an act of suicidal defiance. The price for speaking the truth was the firebombing of your home, the destruction of your business, or a rope thrown over a tree limb with your own name on it. This silence was born from a deep and justified distrust of the law. The police and the courts were not seen as protectors, but as the enforcement arm of the white power structure. To go to sheriffship with information proving Johnson's innocence would be pointless and perilous. The system was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to produce a result, and that result had already been decided. The psychological toll on those who dared to breach this wall was immediate and severe. Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins were the ultimate examples. By taking Johnson's case, they shattered the silence. In return, they were marked men. Their lives were openly threatened, their reputations dragged through the mud. They were hunted in their own city, forced to flee for their very survival. The message sent to the rest of the community was chillingly clear. This is the fate of those who speak. After that, the silence became absolute. With the Tennessee courts turning a deaf ear and the execution date looming, all hope seemed to be lost. The legal road had run out, and the gallows were being prepared. But in the small office of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, a discovery was made that would change the course of American legal history. The forgotten clue they unearthed wasn't a misplaced letter or a hidden diary. It was a fundamental principle that the state of Tennessee had chosen to ignore. It was the United States Constitution. Their argument was as simple as it was revolutionary. They contended that Ed Johnson had not received a trial by a jury of his peers, but had been condemned by a jury of intimidated hostages. A courtroom surrounded by an armed, bloodthirsty mob, they argued, is not a court of law. It is a stage for a legal lynching. This was not a failure of evidence, but a failure of the entire process, a gross violation of Johnson's right to due process under the 14th Amendment. This was their forgotten clue. The trial itself was the crime. With this powerful argument, they did the unthinkable. They bypassed the entire state judicial system and took their appeal directly to the highest court in the land. It was a desperate, audacious gamble, two lone black lawyers from the South petitioning the 9 most powerful jurists in America. And then, the impossible happened. The Supreme Court listened. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a man who had famously dissented in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that enshrined separate but equal, saw the profound injustice. On March 19, 1906, he granted a stay of execution. A telegram was dispatched from Washington, D.C. to Chattanooga. It was a single piece of paper, but it carried the full weight of the United States government, ordering a halt to the execution. The forgotten clue had not just opened a door, it had kicked it off its hinges. For a fleeting, miraculous moment, the law had prevailed. The case was no longer about one man's life. It was now a direct confrontation between the rule of law and the rule of the mob. The telegram from the Supreme Court should have been a shield, an impenetrable barrier of federal authority protecting Ed Johnson. Instead, in the charged atmosphere of Chattanooga, it acted like a lit match tossed into a powder keg. The news spread through the city not as a call for lawful patience, but as an intolerable insult. A distant court in Washington, they felt, had stolen their justice, robbing them of the vengeance they so desperately craved. The city began to simmer, and then to boil. The central mystery was no longer who attacked Nevada Taylor, but who would dare to defy the United States Supreme Court. The answer was not some shadowy figure hiding in the back alleys. The mastermind of the lynching, the man who held the keys to both the jail and to the mob's fury, was Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. His unmasking came not from a forgotten clue, but from his own deliberate, chilling actions on the night of March 19th. His motive was a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, political calculation, and pure racist ideology. The Supreme Court's stay of execution was a direct and public humiliation. It was a declaration that he, the sheriff, had overseen a failed and unconstitutional trial. In his mind, his authority, his honor, and the honor of his community had been trampled by an interfering federal power. Faced with a choice between his oath to uphold the law of the land and his allegiance to the unwritten code of the mob, Sheriff Shipp made his decision. He would side with the mob. The unmasking is found in the sequence of his orders that night. First, he sent the vast majority of his deputies home, leaving the county jail, which held a man now at the center of a national firestorm, almost completely unguarded. Then, he personally disarmed the one remaining jailer, a man named Nicholson, leaving him with only a single, useless key. He had effectively laid out a welcome mat for the violence he knew was coming. The mob that gathered that night was not a spontaneous eruption of chaos. It was an organized force, its leaders emboldened by the silent, implicit permission of the sheriff. They marched on the jail not with the uncertainty of a riot, but with the confidence of men who knew they would face no resistance. When the sledgehammers began to ring against the jailhouse doors, the sound was not just breaking steel, but the shattering of the rule of law. The true culprits were unmasked, a furious mob acting as the fist, and the county sheriff, the man sworn to stop them, acting as the calculating, treacherous mind. The night air of Chattanooga filled with the rhythmic, brutal clang of steel on steel as the mob's sledgehammers beat against the jailhouse doors. Inside, a terrified Ed Johnson listened as his last line of defense was systematically battered into submission. When the doors finally gave way, a river of angry shouts and menacing faces flooded the corridor. Rough hands seized him, dragging him from the relative safety of his cell out into the cold March street. They marched him through the city, a grim procession lit by flickering torches and street lamps. The mob was a beast with 100 heads, and it was parading its victim towards the altar of its rage, the Walnut Street Bridge. The modern steel structure, a symbol of Chattanooga's progress, became a stage for its most medieval impulse. The dark, swirling waters of the Tennessee River flowed silently below, an indifferent witness to the horror about to unfold. On the bridge, under the vast, starless sky, a thick rope was thrown over a steel girder. In this final, terrifying moment, Ed Johnson was granted a chance to speak. His voice, clear and steady, cut through the jeers of the crowd. He did not beg for his life. He proclaimed his truth. "I am an innocent man," he declared to the faces surrounding him. "I am not guilty of this crime. I have said it all the time and I say it now. God bless you all. I am ready to go." Then he was pushed into the void. The rope snapped taut, but the fall did not bring a swift end. As his body twisted in the air, a leader of the mob raised a pistol. A single sharp crack echoed across the river, and Johnson's body went limp. It was followed by another and another. From the bridge above, a fusillade of gunfire erupted. The night was filled with muzzle flashes, each bright spark followed by the sound of a shot, over 50 in all, each one a punctuation mark in a statement of pure defiance. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A ringing silence descended upon the bridge, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the steel girders and the distant bark of a dog. Ed Johnson's body hung motionless, a haunting pendulum suspended between the city and the dark river below. The mob, its terrible work done, quietly began to disperse, leaving their gruesome message hanging in the night for all the world to see. News of the lynching in Chattanooga was not just news of a murder, it was news of a rebellion. The mob, aided by the sheriff, had not just killed a man, they had openly defied a direct order from the United States Supreme Court. The insult was so profound, so audacious, that it shook the halls of power in Washington. President Theodore Roosevelt himself condemned it as a hideous crime. The Supreme Court, its authority fundamentally challenged, decided to do something it had never done before and has never done since. It resolved to hold its own criminal trial. The atmosphere was unlike any other in American history. The case of United States versus Shipp was not held in a Tennessee courthouse filled with angry locals, but before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The defendants, Sheriff Shipp and several leaders of the mob, were summoned to the nation's capital. They walked into the proceedings not with the demeanor of contrite men, but with a quiet, stubborn defiance. Back home, they were heroes who had upheld the Southern Code. In Washington, they were seen as insurrectionists. They were not on trial for murder. The federal court had no jurisdiction for that, but for something just as fundamental: contempt of court, for spitting in the face of the highest law in the land. Shipp and his men maintained their innocence, claiming they were simply overwhelmed by a spontaneous and uncontrollable mob. They presented themselves as hapless peacekeepers, not willing conspirators. But the evidence, painstakingly gathered by federal investigators, told a different story. A story of deputies sent home, of a jail left intentionally unguarded, of a sheriff who had promised the mob they would not be stopped. The verdict, when it finally came down in 1909, was a thunderclap. The Supreme Court of the United States found Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp and 5 of his associates guilty. It was a seismic moment, the first time the federal government had successfully prosecuted the participants of a lynch mob. But then came the sentence. For orchestrating the murder of a man under federal protection and for defying the highest court in the land, Sheriff Shipp was sentenced to serve just 60 days in a federal jail. Justice, it seemed, had been both served and denied in the very same breath. The verdict established a monumental precedent. The rule of law could and would reach down to challenge mob violence, but the punishment was so laughably light that it felt like a slap on the wrist. Shipp served his time and returned to Chattanooga not as a disgraced criminal, but as a celebrated martyr, his reputation enhanced by his brief and comfortable imprisonment. The verdict was a landmark victory for the principle of law, but a bitterly hollow one for the cause of true justice. The lives of everyone touched by the tragedy of Ed Johnson were permanently fractured, their futures sent spinning in new and often tragic directions. For the 2 men who fought for him, Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, the price of their courage was exile. They were hounded from the city they sought to better, their legal practices destroyed, and their lives under constant threat. They became fugitives from the very mob they had tried to defeat in a courtroom, forced to rebuild their lives in the anonymity of the North, their names whispered in Chattanooga's black community with a mixture of reverence and fear. They had won a moral victory, but suffered a devastating personal defeat. The opposite was true for Sheriff Joseph Shipp. He did not return from his 60-day sentence in shame. He was welcomed back to Chattanooga as a conquering hero. He walked the streets not as a convicted criminal who had defied the Supreme Court, but as a champion of Southern honor who had stood up to federal overreach. His complicity in the lynching did not end his career. It solidified his legacy among the white majority. He became a living symbol of the South's defiance, his life a testament to the fact that in the Jim Crow era, some crimes were not only tolerated, but celebrated. Nevada Taylor, the young woman whose assault was the catalyst for the entire nightmare, retreated into a life of quiet obscurity. The trauma of that night in the cemetery was compounded by the horror of what was done in her name. She never spoke publicly of the events again, living out her days in the long shadow of a crime she survived and a murder she inadvertently caused. Her life, like Johnson's, was irrevocably defined by that one terrible night. For the black community of Chattanooga, the lynching of Ed Johnson became a ghost story told for generations, a brutal lesson in the consequences of defiance. It cast a pall of fear that lingered for decades, reinforcing the city's rigid racial hierarchy with the haunting image of a body hanging from the Walnut Street Bridge. But a seed of resolve was also planted. The fight for Ed Johnson's name did not die with him. It was a slow, stubborn pursuit of justice that spanned nearly a century, a legal and moral reckoning passed down through the years, waiting for a time when the city would finally be forced to confront its past. If you walk across Chattanooga's Walnut Street Bridge today, you will see a city reborn. It is now a pedestrian walkway, a beautiful expanse of blue steel where families stroll, cyclists glide by, and tourists take photos of the Tennessee River below. It is a symbol of the city's vibrant present. But the steel beneath your feet tells a different story. The massive girders that support this scene of modern leisure are the very same girders from which a noose was hung in 1906. The bridge is not just a landmark, it is a monument to a murder, a tangible physical remnant of a night of profound horror. For nearly a century, the official story of Ed Johnson was a ghost, a tale whispered in the black community but largely erased from the city's public memory. But ghosts have a way of demanding to be seen. In the year 2000, 94 years after his death, the Hamilton County Court officially overturned Ed Johnson's conviction, a stunning and long overdue admission of the injustice that had been done. The echo of his last words, "I am an innocent man," had finally found its way back into a courtroom and been affirmed as truth. Today, not far from the foot of that very bridge, a new monument stands. It is the Ed Johnson Memorial, a solemn and powerful space dedicated to his memory and to the courage of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins. It is a deliberate act of reclamation, a place where the story is no longer whispered but told in bronze and stone for all to see. It stands as a counter-narrative to the silence, a permanent testament to a history that the city is finally beginning to confront. The mountains that cradle Chattanooga have seen empires rise and fall, and the river has carried 1,000 secrets to the sea. They were the silent witnesses to the crime, the trial, and the lynching. For decades, the world tried to forget what happened on that bridge, to pave over the past with progress. But the steel remembers, the river remembers. And now, thanks to the tireless pursuit of justice, the city is finally being forced to remember too, ensuring that the echo of Ed Johnson's story will never again fade into silence. So we return to the question that hung in the air with Ed Johnson's body. How could this happen in open defiance of the nation's highest court? The answer, we now know, is as simple as it is terrifying. The law is not a fortress of stone. It is a fragile agreement, utterly dependent on the integrity of those sworn to uphold it. On that night in Chattanooga, the man with the badge decided the mob's will was more important than the court's word, and in that moment, the law ceased to exist. But this story is more than just a chronicle of a failure of justice. It is a profound lesson in the slow, stubborn, and often painful pursuit of it. It teaches us that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, as the saying goes, but it does not bend on its own. It must be pulled, inch by painful inch, by the hands of courageous and often forgotten people. Men like Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, who risked everything for a man they knew was innocent, pulled on that arc. Their fight seemed lost in 1906, but it started a conversation that refused to die, a quiet echo that grew louder with each passing generation. The story of Ed Johnson is a reminder that history is never truly in the past. It lives in the steel of a bridge, in the names carved on a memorial, and in the ongoing struggle to reconcile our ideals with our actions. The Supreme Court's verdict was a landmark for the rule of law, but the real justice, the clearing of an innocent man's name, took nearly a century to arrive. It is a story that teaches us that the loudest shouts for truth often come from the quietest graves. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. You know how the law can be both a shield and a sword, and how sometimes it is simply a whisper in a storm of rage. For the law can be written on paper, but justice must be carved into the heart of a community. And that is a task that is never truly finished. On September 14, 2007, a clerk in the Douglas County Courthouse in Nebraska stamped a document that would send a shockwave through the entire legal world. It was a lawsuit, like thousands of others, but the name listed for the defendant wasn't a person or a corporation. It was God. The newspapers called it the act of a madman, a joke taken too far. But the man who filed it was no fool. He was one of the most powerful politicians in the state. Today, we push past the laughter and the headlines to ask a question that strikes at the very heart of law and faith. What happens when a man uses a human court to demand justice from the Almighty? To understand the lawsuit, you first have to understand the man. Ernie Chambers wasn't some crackpot off the street. He was a living legend in Nebraska politics. For nearly 4 decades, he was a senator in the state's unique one-house legislature. He was a lion, a civil rights champion whose voice boomed through the marble halls of the Capitol, fighting for the poor, the forgotten, and the marginalized. He was known for his razor-sharp mind, his unmatched eloquence, and a stubborn refusal to back down from any fight he believed was just. He was a master of the law. He didn't just know the rules. He knew their spirit, their history, and most importantly, their weaknesses. He had spent a lifetime watching the gears of justice turn, sometimes with agonizing slowness, sometimes with breathtaking fairness. He believed in the system, or at least he believed in what it was supposed to be, a shield for the innocent and a sword against the powerful. But in the mid-2000s, Senator Chambers saw a sickness creeping into the courts he so respected. He saw lawsuits that seemed to defy common sense, clogging the dockets and turning halls of justice into a circus. People suing for anything and everything, using the sacred process of the law to settle petty grievances or chase easy money. To a man like Chambers, this wasn't just inefficient. It was a perversion, a mockery of the very idea of justice. He felt the system was becoming a parody of itself. He could have given a fiery speech on the Senate floor. He could have written a scathing newspaper column. But Ernie Chambers wasn't a man who settled for small gestures. He believed that to expose an absurdity, you had to meet it with an even greater absurdity. An idea began to form in his mind, an idea so radical, so audacious, it could only come from a man who knew the law so well he was willing to break its unwritten rules. He decided he would file a lawsuit of his own. But his target wouldn't be a person or a company. He would aim higher. He would take the logic of the frivolous lawsuit and push it to its absolute metaphysical limit. He was about to demonstrate the flaw in the system by creating a case so perfectly logical and yet so utterly impossible that no one would ever be able to forget it. The calm of the Nebraska judicial system was about to be shattered. And so, on a Friday in September, Ernie Chambers walked into the Douglas County Courthouse and fired his shot. The document he filed read not like a legal complaint, but like an indictment against the cosmos itself. With the cold, precise language of the law, he laid out his case against the defendant, God. He accused the Almighty of being directly responsible for untold suffering, for unleashing deadly floods, terrifying hurricanes, and violent tornadoes upon the world. The lawsuit went further. It charged God with making terroristic threats on a global scale, promising death, destruction, and eternal damnation to billions of people, including Senator Chambers and his constituents in Nebraska. It claimed the defendant's actions sowed fear, incited hatred, and led directly to wars, oppression, and genocide. And what did the plaintiff demand? Not money. He demanded a permanent injunction. He asked a human judge to issue a legal order telling God to stop. You can just imagine the silence in the clerk's office as they read the defendant's name. But it was a legally filed document, and they had no choice but to accept it. The news spread like a prairie fire. First, it was a local curiosity, then a statewide joke. Within days, it was international news. The courthouse was flooded with calls from journalists around the world. Was it real? Was the senator serious? To anyone who thought it was a prank, Chambers had a chillingly simple and logical response. He argued that if the courthouse doors were open to any citizen with a grievance, no matter how frivolous it seemed, then they had to be open to him too. He was a citizen. He had a grievance. He had identified the responsible party. The system, he was saying, had to either hear his case or admit that its doors were not, in fact, open to all. The trap had been set. The court had no choice but to respond. The case landed on the desk of Judge Marlon Polk, a man who had dedicated his life to the clear, predictable order of the law. And with that, the entire judicial system of Douglas County, a place built on evidence and procedure, found itself staring into a black hole of its own making. The machinery of justice, designed to handle earthly disputes, had just been tasked with judging heaven. You see, for the wheels of justice to even begin to turn, a fundamental step must be taken. The defendant must be officially notified. A summons must be served. It is the cornerstone of due process, a right so sacred that without it, no case can proceed. And that single simple rule became the entire battlefield. The lawsuit's central question wasn't about floods or tornadoes. It was this: how do you hand a piece of paper to a being who is everywhere and nowhere at once? In the courtroom, Senator Chambers stood before Judge Polk, his face a mask of solemn purpose. He argued with brilliant, infuriating logic. He stated that since the defendant, God, is by definition omniscient, he must already know about the lawsuit. Therefore, a formal summons was an unnecessary piece of human bureaucracy. The court was in a bind. To agree with Chambers would be to make a theological ruling. To disagree would be to ignore the plaintiff's point. Imagine being Judge Marlon Polk, sitting on that bench, the weight of centuries of legal precedent resting on your shoulders. The courtroom wasn't filled with the sounds of chaos. There were no shouts, no struggle. There was only a profound, suffocating silence. It was the sound of a system encountering a problem it was never designed to solve. The air was thick with the tension of an impossible choice. The world's media watched, waiting for the verdict, but the judge was trapped. This wasn't a slaughter of men, but a slaughter of certainty. The weapon wasn't a rifle, but a paradox. Every path the judge could take led to a contradiction. If he dismissed the case as frivolous, he would be violating the principle of open courts that Chambers was so cleverly exploiting. If he allowed it to proceed, he would be throwing the rulebook out the window. The case became a ghost in the machine of justice. It couldn't move forward. It couldn't be dismissed on its merits. The court, an institution of immense power, was rendered utterly impotent. The legal process was bleeding out on the courtroom floor, not from a wound of violence, but from a single, unanswerable question. The mighty sword of the law had struck against the infinite, and it simply stopped. For weeks, the lawsuit hung in the air over Douglas County, a question mark suspended in the halls of justice. The initial shock had given way to a tense, expectant silence. In his chambers, Judge Marlon Polk found himself in a legal no-man's land. He couldn't simply laugh the case out of court. Ernie Chambers was a respected senator, and his legal argument, however bizarre its premise, was technically sound. He was exploiting a loophole in the system's own philosophy of open access. The judge was a man of the book. He searched through volumes of case law, looking for precedent, for any case in history that could offer a sliver of guidance. But there was none. He was searching for a map in a country that didn't exist. The choice before him was monumental. Either he would break the court's own procedural rules, or he would allow a case against God to proceed. Either option would create a legal earthquake. Outside the courthouse walls, the story had become a global phenomenon. Legal scholars debated the jurisdictional paradox on television. Theologians argued the implications of a court even considering the matter. Late-night comedians told jokes, but beneath the laughter was a genuine fascination. Ernie Chambers had done more than file a lawsuit. He had posed a philosophical riddle that caught the imagination of the entire world. And what of Senator Chambers himself? He was the calm at the center of the storm. He gave interviews, not with the triumphant smirk of a prankster, but with the measured tone of a professor. He calmly and patiently explained his reasoning to anyone who asked. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to teach. He had laid the trap, and now he simply watched as the entire legal world wrestled with it, exposing the very absurdity he had set out to demonstrate. The community wasn't in fear, but in a state of captivated disbelief. The courthouse, normally a place of quiet, everyday dramas, had become the stage for a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. Everyone was waiting. The silence from the judge's chambers stretched on, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the silence of a system thinking, of a man wrestling with an impossible problem, preparing to render a judgment that would be remembered for decades to come. And then, the day came. Judge Marlon Polk entered the courtroom, the weight of his decision palpable in the silent, crowded room. This wasn't a trial in the traditional sense. There were no witnesses called to the stand, no dramatic cross-examinations. The battle was fought entirely on the sterile landscape of legal procedure. The world's media held their breath, waiting to see how a small county court would solve a problem that had stumped philosophers for millennia. Judge Polk didn't try to answer the unanswerable. He didn't rule on whether God was responsible for hurricanes or whether the lawsuit had merit. He did something far more clever. He found his answer not in theology, but in the mundane, practical rules of civil procedure. He found the one thread that could unravel the entire case without touching the explosive questions at its core. He dismissed the case. But the reason he gave was a masterpiece of judicial logic. He stated that for the court to hear a case, it must first have jurisdiction over the defendant. And to establish that jurisdiction, the defendant must be properly served a summons. Since the defendant, God, had no fixed address and could not be served notice, the court simply had no power to proceed. The case was thrown out not because it was absurd, but because in the eyes of the law, the Almighty couldn't be found. It was a brilliant legal escape. The judge didn't try to slay the dragon. He simply declared that there was no address to send the challenge to. But Ernie Chambers didn't see it as a defeat. He stood before the reporters, a slight, knowing smile on his face. He argued that the judge's ruling was, in its own way, a profound victory for his cause. For the court to declare that it couldn't find God's address, he reasoned, it first had to implicitly acknowledge that there was someone to find. The verdict was in. The law of men had been applied. The system had protected itself by retreating behind its own procedural walls. But was it justice? Or was it the most elegant sidestep in legal history, a moment where the human system of rules looked into the infinite and chose, wisely, to look away? The gavel had fallen, but the real questions were left hanging, unanswered, in the quiet air of the courtroom. The television cameras eventually left Omaha. The reporters filed their last stories, and the world's attention moved on to the next spectacle. But the case of Chambers versus God never truly disappeared. It simply sank into the bedrock of legal history, becoming something of a legend. Today, it's a story told in law school classrooms, a famous case study used to teach the dry-as-dust concept of jurisdiction. It's a ghost story that lawyers tell, a cautionary tale about the absolute limits of the law. As for Senator Ernie Chambers, he didn't fade into obscurity. He went right back to the Capitol building and continued his life's work. He remained that lion of the Nebraska legislature for years, a fierce, unapologetic voice for his constituents, a constant thorn in the side of the establishment. When he finally left office, he was the longest-serving state senator in Nebraska's history. His legacy is one of fighting for the powerless, and this lawsuit was just his most famous weapon in a long and storied career. And the lawsuit itself? That document is still there, filed away in the archives of the Douglas County Courthouse. It's just a few pages of typed words in a manila folder, a humble physical artifact of a metaphysical battle. It bears no special markings. It isn't framed on a wall. but it is a silent witness, a tangible piece of a story that seems too absurd to be true. It's proof that once, a man walked into a courthouse and tried to hold the creator of the universe accountable under the laws of Nebraska. Most people have forgotten the headlines, and the name Marlon Polk is just another name on a long list of judges. But the system remembers. The archives remember. The story of that impossible lawsuit has become a permanent, if strange, part of American legal folklore, an echo in the halls of justice that serves as a quiet reminder of the day a mortal man used human rules to challenge the divine. So we come back to the question we started with. What happens when a man uses a human court to demand justice from the Almighty? The simple answer is, the court finds a way out. The system protects itself. But that's not the real lesson here. Ernie Chambers never expected to win an injunction against God. He wasn't trying to stop the rain. He was trying to make a point. This story isn't really about a battle between a man and his maker. It's a story about a brilliant mind using the logic of the law against itself to ask an eternal question. Who is truly responsible for the suffering in the world? And where are the limits of our own systems of justice? He held a mirror up to the court and forced it to admit that there are some problems, some defendants, that are simply too big for its rules to handle. It's a story of protest in its purest, most creative form. It teaches us that sometimes, to expose an absurdity, you must become an even greater one. Ernie Chambers was willing to look like a fool to the entire world to prove a point about the sanctity of justice. He never got a response from the defendant, but he forced a worldwide conversation, and in doing so, he achieved a far greater victory. Two days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back, a coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills. Who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper Southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the Bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the Younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybelle. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired: brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the Bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano, she was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure, and the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies: Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested 2 Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The 2 shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The bandit queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian Territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The queen was dead, but who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, Deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge, picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive, a dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next, or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the Bandit Queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Belle's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Belle had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Belle had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so, the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the Bandit Queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Bell's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Bell had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Bell's star, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Bell's Star, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jesse James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, the educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Bell's Star? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Bell's Star was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, there could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the Bandit Queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode. Imagine the morning fog over Moorhead, Kentucky on June 22, 1887. It doesn't carry the smell of wood smoke or damp earth. It carries the deafening roar of 100 rifles firing at once. This wasn't a simple duel. It was a full-scale battle, waged street by street, where neighbors hunted neighbors from behind windows and doorways. The history books call it the Rowan County War, often dismissing it as just another mountain feud. But was it? How does a quiet county seat turn into a slaughterhouse? And how does one man, a charismatic saloon owner, become its undisputed king, holding life and death in his hands? Today, we separate the smoke of legend from the fire of truth to understand how a political argument on a hot August day unleashed 3 years of terror. To understand the blood that was spilled, you first have to understand the land. This was Rowan County, Kentucky, in the years after the Civil War. A place carved out of the Appalachian Mountains, where steep hills and deep, shadowed hollows kept communities isolated, suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely self-reliant. Here, the law wasn't something that came from the state capital in Frankfurt. It was something made by the men who held the most land, commanded the most respect, or carried the fastest gun. The forests provided a living, the cornfields provided the bread, and the family name provided your identity. It was a world that ran on its own clock and lived by its own unwritten rules. At the heart of this world were two powerful currents, pulling the county in opposite directions. On one side, you had the Martins and their allies. These were the Democrats, the old guard. They were farmers and landowners, men whose families had worked this soil for generations. They saw Rowan County as their birthright, a legacy to be protected. Their leader, John Martin, was a respected figure, the patriarch of a clan that embodied the traditional values of the mountains. They were the establishment, the deep roots of the county. On the other side stood Craig Tolliver and his followers. They were the Republicans, the ambitious newcomers who saw the future not just in farming, but in business, commerce, and control of the growing town of Moorhead. Tolliver himself was a force of nature. He wasn't some backwoods brawler. He was a sharp, charismatic, and utterly ruthless man who ran the town's most prosperous saloons. He knew that real power didn't come from owning a few acres of land. It came from controlling the flow of money, whiskey, and votes. He was a political boss in the making, and his iron will was beginning to forge Moorhead into his personal kingdom. This wasn't a simple family feud, not in the way the legends tell it. The names Martin and Tolliver became flags, banners under which people gathered based on their politics, their debts, their family ties, or simple fear. If you were a Democrat who felt the old ways were best, you stood with the Martins. If you were a Republican who saw opportunity in the changing times, you threw your lot in with Tolliver. Choosing a side wasn't just a political preference, it was a declaration of loyalty that could determine whether your family ate well or starved, whether you found justice in a courtroom or at the end of a rope. Life in Rowan County went on, with harvests and church socials, births and funerals. But underneath the surface, a bitter tension was simmering. It was the friction between the old world and the new, between the farmer and the businessman, the Democrat and the Republican. Every election, every business deal, every drunken argument was another ounce of pressure building in a sealed container. They were living in a powder keg, and they all knew it. All they were waiting for was the spark that would blow their world to pieces. The spark finally landed on Election Day, in the thick, muggy air of August 1884. You can almost feel it. The town of Moorhead is buzzing, not with excitement, but with a raw, nervous energy. The air is heavy with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Men, their loyalties and their tempers stoked by liquor and politics, are gathered near the polling station, eyeing each other with suspicion. It was here that the first words were thrown like stones. The argument started between a Republican named Solomon Bradley and the Democratic patriarch John Martin. It was the same argument happening all over the county, a clash of the old world and the new. But then, a new player stepped into the circle, Floyd Tolliver, a relative of Craig's. The shouting quickly turned to shoving, and in the chaotic scuffle there was a flash of steel. In a single brutal motion, Floyd Tolliver's knife found its mark, and John Martin, the leader of the county's Democrats, fell bleeding into the dust. This was more than a murder. It was a public execution, a message sent in broad daylight. The Republicans had struck down the head of the Democratic snake. The Martin clan, stunned and enraged, demanded justice. They turned to the law, but in Rowan County, the law had a name, and that name was Craig Tolliver. He controlled the courts, he controlled the sheriff, he controlled the narrative. And so, it came as no surprise to anyone when a jury declared Floyd Tolliver had acted in self-defense and set him free. For the Martin clan, that verdict wasn't justice. It was a declaration of war. It was proof that the system was rotted through, and that the only law they could trust was the one they enforced themselves. They retreated into the hills, not in defeat, but to plan. A few cold months later, in December, Floyd Tolliver was walking down the main street of Moorhead, wrapped in the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. A sudden volley of rifle fire erupted from a darkened alleyway. Floyd fell dead onto the frozen ground, his body riddled with the Martins' answer to the court's verdict. The blood of John Martin had been answered with the blood of Floyd Tolliver. A personal score had been settled, but a terrible line had been crossed. There was no going back now. The first drops had been spilled, and they had opened a wound that would bleed for 3 long years, turning the hollows and streets of Rowan County into a hunting ground. The war had begun. For 2 years, the war had been a story of back-alley ambushes and simmering fear. On June 22nd, 1887, it exploded into the open. Before the sun had fully risen, nearly 100 men from the Martin faction descended on Moorhead. They moved not as a frantic mob, but as a determined army, entering the town from multiple directions with a single, unified purpose: to cut the head off the snake and end the reign of Craig Tolliver. The first shot wasn't a single crack, but a deafening, rolling thunderclap as dozens of rifles opened fire at once. For the townspeople huddled in their homes and cellars, the world dissolved into a terrifying storm of noise. They could hear the high-pitched whistle of bullets passing overhead, the splintering crash of lead tearing through wooden walls, and the sharp ring of ricochets off anything solid. The street outside was no longer a place for commerce or conversation. It had become a no-man's land. Through the shifting curtains of gunsmoke, a deadly ballet unfolded. Tolliver's men, barricaded inside saloons and hotels, turned second-story windows into sniper nests. The Martins and their allies returned fire from behind overturned carts and the corners of buildings, methodically advancing toward the center of town. Moorhead had become a brutal chessboard where every move was a gamble with death, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt black powder. This was a war of neighbors, and the cost was intimate. At some point during the hours of relentless battle, a sharp cry of grief cut through the roar of the guns from the Martin side. One of their own had fallen, John Martin's son. A leader in the fight had been forced to watch his own bloodline severed in the chaos, a father's worst nightmare realized in a hail of gunfire. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just become personal in the most painful way imaginable. And then, at the height of the battle, the central pillar of the conflict simply vanished. Craig Tolliver, the undisputed king of Moorhead, had been directing his defense from a fortified position, a commanding presence against the storm. One moment, his voice was the anchor for his men. The next, there was only silence from his post. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic duel, just a sudden, shocking absence. A single, unseen shot, fired by a Martin sharpshooter or a treacherous ally no one would ever know for sure, had found its mark. As the news rippled through the ranks, the fighting faltered. The organized defense collapsed into confusion. The gunfire sputtered out, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. When the smoke finally began to clear, it revealed a town that had been brutalized. The walls of buildings were scarred with hundreds of dark marks, silent witnesses to the fury that had just passed. The battle was over. The king was dead. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a stunned silence fell over Moorhead. It was the silence of a graveyard. Slowly, cautiously, doors creaked open. Townspeople emerged from their cellars and hiding places, not to a town celebrating a victory, but to a scene of utter devastation. The streets were littered with shattered glass, splintered wood, and the dark, still shapes of men who had been alive just hours before. The air, thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder, now carried the heavy weight of shock and grief. The war was over, but the town felt like it had died with it. For the Martin faction, their objective was complete. Craig Tolliver was dead. They hadn't stayed to claim Moorhead as a prize. That was never the point. Their army of 100 men melted back into the hills and hollows from which they came, leaving the chaos behind them. They had rid the county of the man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had declared war not just on a rival faction, but on the state of Kentucky itself. They were no longer just feuding mountaineers, they were now fugitives. The Tolliver faction, once the iron fist that ruled the county, was shattered. With their leader gone, they were a body without a head. Panic and fear replaced the arrogant confidence they once held. Some of his most loyal men lay dead in the streets, while others, wounded or terrified of what was to come, fled the county, knowing that either the Martins' revenge or the state's justice would soon be coming for them. The empire Craig Tolliver had built with bullets and fear had crumbled into dust in a single morning. This time, the news of the slaughter didn't just prompt a temporary response from the governor, it demanded a permanent solution. The state of Kentucky had had enough. Soldiers of the state militia were dispatched to Rowan County, but they didn't come as peacekeepers to separate two bickering families. They arrived as an occupying force, with orders to disarm the populace and impose state law by force. Martial law, ineffective not in name, descended on Moorhead. The era of clan rule was over, brought to an end by the cold steel of state-issued bayonets. With the militia securing the town, the gears of official justice began to grind. Warrants were issued for dozens of men from the Martin faction. Rewards were posted for their capture, turning neighbors against one another with the promise of gold. But the fear in Rowan County didn't disappear. It simply went quiet. People who had witnessed the battle locked their doors and their mouths, terrified of getting caught in the crossfire between the vengeful Martins and the newly empowered state authorities. The gun smoke had cleared, but a new suffocating fog of suspicion and fear had settled over the hills. The gavels that fell in the Rowan County courthouse weren't just calling a room to order. They were trying to hammer a new reality into place. The trials that followed the Moorhead massacre were meant to be a display of state power, a clear message that the days of clan law were over. The courtroom itself was a theater of tension. It was the same building whose walls were still pockmarked with bullet holes from the battle. Armed militia guards stood at every entrance, their presence a constant reminder that this was not business as usual. The benches were packed with onlookers, family of the accused, Tolliver sympathizers, and curious strangers, all watching to see if the law of Kentucky was stronger than the code of the mountains. In the defendant's box sat the men of the Martin faction. But they didn't look like defeated criminals. You have to understand, in their own eyes, and in the eyes of many in the county, they weren't murderers. They were liberators. They had faced a tyrant that the law itself had failed to control. So they sat there, not with remorse, but with a quiet, stubborn dignity. They had done what they felt they had to do, and they were prepared to face the consequences, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Their defiance was a silent challenge to the entire proceeding. The legal battle was as fierce as the gunfight that preceded it. Cunning lawyers for the defense didn't just argue points of law, they put Craig Tolliver's entire reign of terror on trial. They painted a picture of a county held hostage, where the legal system was a corrupt tool in the hands of one man. They argued that the attack on Moorhead wasn't an act of aggression, but an act of desperation, a people rising up to reclaim their own government. It was a powerful narrative that resonated deeply with a jury of their peers, men who had lived through those same dark years. And then came the verdicts. One by one, the men who had marched on Moorhead and waged open war in its streets faced the judge. And one by one, the astonishing results came in. Some were convicted of lesser charges and given light sentences. Others were acquitted entirely. In the end, not a single man was executed for their role in the battle. The most prominent leaders of the Martin faction eventually received pardons from a sympathetic Democratic governor, effectively wiping their slates clean. The state had flexed its muscle, but the outcome felt less like a verdict and more like a negotiated truce. The old power structure was broken, and a new one, led by the Democrats, had taken its place. The men who had taken the law into their own hands had been vindicated, not by the mountains, but by the very system they had attacked. So, was this justice? The Tolliver faction was gone, their leader buried. The Martin faction, despite laying siege to a town, walked free. The law of men had been spoken in the courtroom, but the final judgment sounded an awful lot like the justice of the mountains. It left a profound and unsettling question hanging in the Appalachian air. Who really won the war? The war ended, but the peace was a fragile, bitter thing. The hatred stirred up by the feud didn't vanish with the last puff of gunsmoke. They seeped into the soil of Rowan County and poisoned the roots of the community for generations. For decades after the massacre, the names Martin and Tolliver were spoken with caution. They dictated who you did business with, whose children your children were allowed to marry, and which side of the aisle you stood on in local politics. The shooting had stopped, but the war lived on in quiet, resentful hearts. If you visit Moorhead today, you might think the past has been completely erased. It's a bustling university town now, full of students who know more about textbooks than blood feuds. But the ghosts are still there, if you know where to look for them. For many years, the old courthouse stood as the most stubborn witness. Visitors could run their hands over the dozens of pockmarks scarring its brick walls, each one a physical memory of that terrible morning in 1887. And up in the cemetery, you can still find the grave of Craig Tolliver, the fallen king, a simple stone marker for a man who once held the county in an iron fist. But the most powerful reminders aren't the ones you can touch. They're in the landscape itself. The main street of Moorhead is no longer a battlefield, but the ghosts of the men who fought and died there still linger in the local lore. The winding back roads and shadowed hollows leading out of town were once the sites of countless ambushes and secret meetings. They are quiet now, but it's a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that holds stories. Most people who walk those streets today have forgotten the names of Craig Tolliver and John Martin. The story of the Rowan County War has faded from living memory into the dry pages of history books. But the story hasn't truly vanished. It has simply become part of the place itself. It's a lesson embedded in the land, a reminder of how quickly order can break down and how thin the line is between neighbor and enemy. The people may forget the details, but the mountains always remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the gunsmoke at the start of our story. How does a quiet county turn into a battlefield? The answer, buried for a century under the myth of a simple family squabble, is now clear. The Rowan County War was never just a feud. It was a political war, fought for the soul of a community. The names Martin and Tolliver were the banners, but the real conflict was over power, control, and whose vision of the future would prevail. Craig Tolliver became a king because he understood that in a place where the law was weak, the strongest will becomes the law. And the Martins went to war because they believed the only way to fight a broken system was to burn it to the ground. This story is more than a dark chapter in Kentucky's history. It is a brutal lesson in what happens when people lose faith in their institutions, when they believe the ballot box is broken and the judge's gavel is for sale. It shows that when official justice becomes a mockery, men will seek out their own, older and bloodier form of justice in the streets. This is a story not just of Appalachian violence, but of the indomitable and sometimes terrifying spirit of people who refuse to be ruled by a tyrant, even if it means becoming killers themselves. It is a grim reminder that the line between civilization and chaos is not a fortress wall, but a thin, fragile thread of trust. And when that thread is cut, the most ordinary of places can become a hell on earth. The men who fought and died in Moorhead have long since turned to dust, but the lesson they left behind, written in blood and gunpowder, must never be forgotten. They said bullets curved around him in the air. They whispered that he could melt into the mountain fog like a ghost, that he'd made a deal with the devil himself in some dark and lonely hollow. For years, the name Jacko Fraser was enough to make a child stop crying and a grown man bolt his door at night. The law called him a murderer. But the people who lived and died in these hills had another name for him: the White Devil. But how does a man become a monster? How does flesh and blood turn into a legend that haunts a landscape for 100 years? Today, we hunt for the truth behind the ghost story. To understand a man like Jacko Fraser, you first have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the Cumberland Mountains in the late 1800s on the jagged border of Virginia and Kentucky. This was a land forgotten by God and the government, a place of stunning beauty and breathtaking cruelty. The mists that clung to the hollows hid deep secrets, and the ancient hills had seen more than their share of blood and tears. The Civil War had ripped through these communities, leaving behind not just poverty, but a generation of men who had been taught that the fastest way to solve a problem was with a rifle. They came home to find their farms in ruins and their futures uncertain. The law, in this part of the world, was a distant rumor. A county sheriff might hold authority in the dusty courthouse square, but out in the winding creeks and isolated cabins, his power faded to nothing. Here, a different law held sway, the law of the clan. Family was everything. Your name was your flag, your cousins were your army. An insult to one was an insult to all, and debts of honor were paid in blood. This was the era of the great feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, where violence was not just an outburst of anger, but a structured part of life, a grim inheritance passed down from father to son. This fierce loyalty was born of isolation. The dense forests and impassable ridges didn't just separate families from the outside world, they separated them from each other. Every farmstead was its own small kingdom, every cabin a fortress. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and a man representing the government was seen as the biggest stranger of all. People here learned to rely on themselves, their kin, and their own judgment. But self-reliance couldn't always put food on the table. This was a world of grinding poverty. Families survived on what they could scratch from the rocky soil, what they could hunt in the deep woods, and what they could distill in a hidden still under the light of the moon. For a man with a quick trigger finger and no conscience, the desperation hanging in the air smelled like opportunity. It was into this boiling cauldron of pride, poverty, and clan justice that Jacko Fraser was born. The world he saw was not a place of laws and morals, but a battlefield for survival. The mountains were poised on a knife's edge, holding a fragile, violent peace. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by an invading army, but by a monster it had created in its own image. Long before the massacre that made him a legend, Jacko Fraser's name was already a poison whispered on the mountain wind. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His terror was fed by a network of lesser evils and silent supporters. Men like Henley Cox, his most notorious accomplice, were drawn to him like moths to a flame. lesser predators orbiting a greater one. And there were others, the small-time crooks who bought his stolen goods, the informants who'd trade a neighbor's whereabouts for a silver dollar or just to settle an old score. The Mullins clan, on the other hand, were the opposite of everything Jacko stood for. They were a large, well-respected family, a cornerstone of the community, which made them the perfect target for a man who wanted to prove that no one and nothing was safe. The deepest wounds in these mountains were often the oldest. Jacko himself was said to be a veteran of the Confederacy, a man who had seen the world burn and decided he liked the heat. He didn't come back from the war looking for peace. He came back carrying the war inside him, a personal battle against a world he felt had failed him. His grudge wasn't over a single plot of land or a stolen horse. His grudge was with humanity itself. He saw society as a sham, and he aimed to tear its mask off with violence. Of course, smaller, more personal grudges festered in every hollow. A card game that ended in a bitter accusation, a dispute over a property line that had been argued for generations, a family that got a little too prosperous for a neighbor's liking. These were the hidden fault lines running beneath the community. Jacko was a master at exploiting them. He understood the dark currents of envy and resentment that flowed beneath the surface of daily life, and he knew how to use them to his advantage, turning the quiet suspicions between neighbors into open fear. And so, the rumors began to spread, moving from cabin to cabin like a sickness in the air. At first, they were just unsettling stories. A peddler who was supposed to be heading through Pound Gap simply vanished. A farmer found his best mule gone, his tack shed emptied. A lone traveler would arrive at the next settlement pale and shaken, telling a story of being robbed on the trail by a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. None of these were big enough to bring the law down from the state capital, but they were carefully stacked, one on top of the other, building a foundation of dread. Every story, filtered through a dozen mouths around a dozen hearths, grew darker and more menacing. The whispers turned into a constant, low hum of anxiety that settled over the mountains. People began to look at the shadows a little longer. The sound of a horse at night was no longer a comfort, but a cause for alarm. The community was being slowly poisoned, not just by Jacko's deeds, but by the fear of what he might do next. The stage was being set for an act of violence so brutal it would turn whispered rumors into terrified screams. The year was 1892. For the Mullins clan, it was a day of prosperity. Several members of the family, including Ira Mullins, his wife, and other kinsmen, had made the long journey by wagon to the nearest town. They were returning home, their carts laden with goods, and more importantly, their pockets heavy with cash from a successful day of trading. We're talking several $100s, a staggering fortune in those mountains, enough money to set a family up for a year, or to make a desperate man do the unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A narrow mountain path, barely wide enough for their wagons, snaking its way through the dense, dark woods of Pound Gap. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fail, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the edges of the trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horses were the only sounds in a world that was growing unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The woods were holding their breath. It was a feeling every mountain person knows in their bones. The difference between a peaceful silence and a waiting one. Perhaps one of the men glanced nervously into the darkening trees. Perhaps a child in the wagon pulled a blanket a little tighter around their shoulders, sensing a shift in the air. They were on their own land, just miles from the safety of their homes, but that feeling of safety was beginning to fray like an old rope. They were being watched. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the forest, a command rang out, a harsh voice slicing through the quiet, telling them to halt. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Before the echo had even died, the trees erupted in a blaze of rifle fire. The led horse screamed and reared, falling in its traces. The quiet evening was shattered by the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, and the first cries of shock and pain. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. The point of no return had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of violence that would stain these mountains forever. The ambush was brutally efficient. The narrow pass became a slaughter pen, a claustrophobic trap from which there was no escape. The first volley of shots sent a wave of chaos through the wagon train. It was a cacophony of terror, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the rock walls, the splintering of wagon boards, the high-pitched screaming of wounded horses, and the raw human cries of disbelief and agony. Men who had been solid, living figures just a second before now crumpled to the ground, becoming nothing more than dark shapes in the failing light. But the attackers were not wild animals in a frenzy. They moved with a chilling purpose, emerging from the tree line like specters. Among them, one figure moved with a terrifying calm, his pale eyes scanning the wreckage with an unnerving detachment. This was not a fight. It was a harvest. As the survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist, Jacko Fraser and his men moved in, their rifles barking with methodical precision, each shot finding its mark. Ira Mullins lay wounded in the dirt, the life seeping out of him onto the very land his family had worked for generations. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Jacko Fraser standing there, his face as impassive as carved stone. There was no rage in his eyes, no flicker of emotion at all. It was the cold, empty gaze of a man looking at an object, not a human being. A revolver appeared in Jacko's hand. The metallic click of its hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Then came a single sharp report that slammed the door shut on Ira Mullins's life. With the killing done, a new and even more grotesque phase began. Jacko knelt beside the body of the man he had just executed, and with the calm demeanor of a clerk counting change, reached into his pockets and retrieved the thick roll of money. This cold ritual was repeated as the gang moved from one still form to another, their hands searching pockets and pouches. They were not just murderers, they were grave robbers, desecrating their victims before the bodies had even grown cold. When the last echo of gunfire had faded and the last coin had been pocketed, what remained was a tableau from hell. A wagon lay on its side, its contents, flour, cloth, tools, spilled across the dirt road like the entrails of a dying beast. The horses lay tangled in their harnesses, their great bodies still and silent. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavy and motionless. It was the silence that was the worst part, a profound, deafening silence where just moments before there had been life, laughter, and hope. And as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Jacko and his men didn't flee in a panic. They simply stepped back into the deep woods, swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed them. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up, unleashed its demons, and then closed again, leaving behind no evidence of their passage, only the wreckage of a family and a silence that screamed. This was more than a robbery. It was more than murder. It was a statement written in blood on a lonely mountain trail. It was a declaration that there were no safe places, that the bonds of family and community were no shield against a man with a frozen heart. On that day, in the twilight of Pound Gap, John Fraser the outlaw died, and Jacko, the White Devil, was well and truly born. The silence that followed the massacre was deeper than any grave. For a time, the only witnesses were the ancient trees and the cold, unblinking stars. It was a kinsman sent out from the Mullins homestead when the wagons failed to return who stumbled into the nightmare. He found the scene not by sound, but by its terrible stillness. The dark, hulking shape of the overturned wagon, the pale glimmer of spilled flour on the ground looking like a dusting of snow, and then the bodies, scattered among the wreckage like fallen leaves, their stillness an affront to nature itself. The cry that broke from that man's throat was a sound of pure horror, an animal howl of grief that finally shattered the unholy calm. When the news reached the Mullins family, it was like a physical blow, a shock that left them gasping for air. But in the Appalachian heart, grief is a fast-burning fire that quickly turns to iron resolve. The women's wails of sorrow echoed through the hollows, a heartbreaking chorus for the dead. But the men's faces were a different kind of terrible. Their grief was silent, their eyes hard and cold, their hands resting on the stocks of the rifles that were never far from reach. They tenderly carried their dead home, but in their hearts, they were already carrying a vow of vengeance. News in the mountains travels not on wires, but on the wind, passed from cabin to cabin in hushed, urgent whispers. The story of the Pound Gap massacre spread like a plague of fear. It confirmed every dark suspicion, every campfire ghost story. The name Jacko Fraser was no longer just a name. It was a curse, the living embodiment of every settler's deepest fear, the fear of what lurked in the untamed wilderness just beyond the light of their lanterns. Doors were bolted earlier. Men took their rifles with them to plow the fields. The comfortable darkness of the mountains, once a familiar blanket, now felt like a shroud, filled with unseen, malevolent eyes. The sheer brutality of the attack was too much to be ignored, even by the distant and often indifferent hand of the law. The murders weren't just a crime, they were an insurrection against the very idea of society. The authorities in both Virginia and Kentucky, pressured by the influential families and a terrified populace, were finally prodded awake. A substantial reward was offered for the capture of Jacko Fraser and his gang, a fortune that could make a poor man rich for life. The notice was nailed to the courthouse doors and the sides of general stores, turning the ghost into a wanted man with a price on his head. The bodies of the Mullins family were laid to rest in the cold mountain earth, but their story refused to be buried. The massacre became a line drawn in the dirt. On one side was the world of families, faith, and hard work. On the other was Jacko Fraser. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the White Devil, a figure of folklore born from a real-world atrocity. The hunt was now not just a matter of law, but a crusade. The question was, how do you hunt a man who is already a ghost? The bounty posters were barely dry before the hunt began. This was not going to be a simple posse of local farmers. The states of Virginia and Kentucky marshaled their forces, calling in the best they had. They hired professional detectives from the famed Baldwin Felts agency, outsiders with city methods and a reputation for ruthlessness. But the man chosen to lead the hunt was a legend in his own right, Marshal Big Ed Hall. He was a man cast from the same mountain rock as Jacko, who knew every secret trail and hidden hollow. He was Jacko's opposite, a man of the mountains who had chosen the badge over the outlaw's gun. And alongside the lawmen and hired guns rode men with faces like stone. They were the kin of the murdered Mullins family. They weren't there for the reward money. They were there to settle a family score, and their justice wasn't written in any law book. Hunting Jacko Fraser in the Cumberland Mountains was like trying to catch a whisper in the wind. He was in his element, a predator on his home ground. The very landscape that the posse found so punishing was his greatest ally. The mountains that had cradled him now conspired to hide him. For weeks, they combed the ridges and ravines, a grueling ordeal of cold nights and false trails. The posse would find the embers of a campfire still warm, or a footprint in the mud of a creek bed, only to have the trail vanish into thin air. It was as if Jacko could simply dissolve into the mist. The mountains that had once been a home to the posse members had now become a deadly labyrinth, and in its center lurked a monster who knew every turn. The posse grew weary, their resolve frayed by frustration and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. They knew Jacko was out there, seeing them long before they saw him. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an ambush, every shadowy rock formation a sniper's nest. But in the end, it wasn't a tracker's skill or a detective's logic that cornered the White Devil. It was human weakness. A name was whispered to the lawmen. An informant, tempted by the life-changing reward or simply terrified into submission, gave up Jacko's hiding place. The mountain's code of silence had finally been broken by the one thing stronger than loyalty: fear. The tip-off led them to a lonely, isolated cabin near the Kentucky border. They surrounded it in the dead of night, a ring of steel closing in under a moonless sky. As the first grey light of dawn touched the peaks, Big Ed Hall gave the signal. The quiet morning was torn apart by a final desperate volley of gunfire as Jacko tried to fight his way out. But it was hopeless. He was one man against a small army. When they dragged him out into the light, blinking and bloodied, the posse members steeled themselves, expecting to see a demon. Instead, they saw a man. His clothes were ragged, his body weary from weeks on the run, but his eyes were the same. In their icy depths, there was no fear, no regret, not even anger. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, and the bottomless exhaustion of a man who knows his road has come to an end. For the lawmen, it was the end of a manhunt. But for the Mullins kin who stood there, watching the man who had destroyed their world, the look in their eyes said that true justice had not yet begun. The arrest of the White Devil was a sensation. His trial in Wise, Virginia, was a pilgrimage. People came from 3 states, on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, clogging the dusty streets of the small county seat. They weren't there to see justice done. They were there to see the monster in a cage. The courthouse stood under the watchful eye of armed guards, its lawn transformed into a sprawling camp of onlookers. The air buzzed with a carnival-like energy, a strange mix of grim satisfaction and morbid curiosity. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a public exorcism. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick enough to choke on. Every bench was crammed, with men standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The judge, the lawyers with their starched collars, the 12 men in the jury box, they were all part of a system trying to impose its formal logic on a story of primal savagery. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Their voices trembled with a mixture of grief and lingering fear as they recounted the horrors of that evening in Pound Gap. They pointed trembling fingers at the man sitting at the defendant's table, and Jacko Fraser just sat there. He showed no remorse, no fear, not even a flicker of interest. As survivors wept on the stand, he watched them with the same detached curiosity a man might watch a bug crawling across a windowsill. His silence was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He was a void, a black hole of human feeling in the center of the room, and his cold, defiant calm was his final weapon. He refused to play their game, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was a monster, and he seemed content to let them know it. The trial was, as everyone knew it would be, a formality. The evidence was absolute, the testimony unshakable. When the jury filed back in, their faces were grim and set. The foreman didn't need to clear his throat. His voice was steady and clear as he pronounced the single word that everyone had come to hear: guilty. A collective sigh, a wave of relief and whispered approval washed over the courtroom. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty, sentenced John Jacko Fraser to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The law of men had spoken. But as the crowd spilled back out into the sunlight, a question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every person who called these mountains home. Was this justice? A clean, quick, state-sanctioned death on a gallows? Did that truly pay the debt for the ambush in Pound Gap, for the cold-blooded murder of men in front of their families? The law had delivered a verdict, a neat and tidy conclusion. But the justice of the mountains, the old law of blood for blood, demanded something more. It demanded an ending as brutal as the beginning. The court had provided a legal answer, but the people were still waiting for a final moral one. On September 15, 1893, a trapdoor opened in Wise, Virginia, and the physical life of Jacko Fraser came to an end. They say a great sigh of relief swept through the crowd, as if a poison had finally been purged from the air. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a common fate for notorious outlaws, to prevent his final resting place from becoming either a shrine or a site of desecration. The earth simply swallowed its monster, leaving no stone to mark his passage. The man was gone, but his ghost was just beginning to walk. The story of the Mullins family did not end in that dusty pass. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and did what mountain people have always done: they endured. Their family line continued, a testament to a resilience far stronger than Jacko's nihilistic rage. Today, their descendants still live in those hills, carrying the memory of the massacre not as a chilling legend, but as a deep and painful part of their family history. Their names are carved in stone in old family cemeteries, the date of their death a permanent, silent, and defiant answer to the violence that tried to erase them. The world has changed dramatically since that bloody evening. A modern highway, US Route 23, now carves a smooth paved path through Pound Gap. You can drive through the very spot where the ambush happened at 70 miles an hour, listening to the radio, your mind a million miles away. But if you pull over to the side of the road, cut the engine and listen, the modern world falls away. The woods are just as deep, the shadows just as long. In the quiet, you can almost feel the weight of that terrible silence from so long ago. The old courthouse in Wise still stands, a brick-and-mortar witness that has held the story within its walls for over a century. And of course, there is the legend of the treasure. Like all famous outlaws, Jacko was rumored to have stashed his ill-gotten fortune, thousands of dollars in gold and silver coin, somewhere in the labyrinthine caves and crevices of the Cumberland Mountains. For decades after his death, treasure hunters, armed with old maps and older rumors, dug into the hillsides, chasing the ghost's promise of cursed gold. The treasure was never found, of course, but the hunt itself became a part of the story, keeping the White Devil's name alive, a whisper of greed and danger that echoed through the generations. Most people have forgotten the facts of the case. The official records are yellowed and brittle, gathering dust in courthouse archives. But the mountains have a long memory. The name Jacko Fraser still surfaces from time to in these parts, a dark ballad told around a late-night fire. He is no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a piece of the landscape itself, a warning, a folktale, a permanent shadow that time has not been able to erase. So we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How does a man become a monster? The story of Jacko Fraser gives us a chilling answer. He wasn't born a demon. He was forged in the fires of a brutal war and hammered into shape on the anvil of a lawless, desperate land. He was the ultimate consequence of a world where civilization was a distant rumor and survival was a daily battle. The White Devil wasn't a supernatural force. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had shed every last piece of his humanity and embraced the darkness that waits inside us all. And how does a monster become a legend? His cruelty was so absolute, so far beyond the normal feuds and fights of the mountains, that people had to make him more than a man to understand him. It was easier to believe he was a ghost who could melt into the fog, a demon who had made a pact with Satan, than to accept the horrifying truth, that a human being, a man of flesh and blood, could be capable of such cold, empty evil. The legend of Jacko Fraser wasn't just a story told to frighten children. It was a story adults told themselves to make sense of the senseless. This isn't just a tale of true crime. It's a parable etched into the very rock of these mountains. It is a story of the terrible beauty and brutal reality of the Appalachian frontier. It reminds us that for every hero there is a shadow, and that the history of this place is written in both courage and in blood. Jacko Fraser was more than a murderer. He was the living embodiment of the mountain people's deepest, darkest fear, the fear of what lurks in the shadows just beyond your own doorstep. And now, my friends, You know the rest of the story. Imagine a man standing in the twilight of the Appalachian Mountains. A shotgun roars, and the buckshot tears through the air, striking him square in the face. But the man doesn't fall. He doesn't even scream. He simply spits the lead pellets onto the ground as if they were cherry pits, a cold grin spreading across his face. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was the reality for those who dared to cross Tally Iron Jaws Hall. The whispers in Wise County said he was more than a man. They said he was enchanted, that bullets couldn't kill him. But was he a demon born of mountain folklore? Or was the truth something far stranger, something hidden in the very marrow of his bones? Today, we separate the legend from the man to find out what really made Tally Hall the bandit who couldn't be killed. To understand the man, you must first understand the mountains that made him. In the late 19th century, Wise County, Virginia, was a world unto itself. It was a labyrinth of steep hollows, dense forests, and rushing creeks where the outside world felt 1,000,000 miles away. The land was both a provider and a tyrant. It gave families corn from the bottomlands and game from the woods, but it demanded back-breaking work in return. Life here was simple, hard, and governed by unwritten laws older than any courthouse. Family was everything, and an insult to your kin was an insult to you. In this world, Mabra Tally Hall was born. He wasn't born a monster or a legend. He was just another mountain boy, learning the ways of his people. And in these parts, the most important craft, the very lifeblood of the local economy, was turning corn into whiskey. Moonshining wasn't seen as a crime by many. It was a tradition, a skill passed from father to son. It was how you turned a surplus crop into cash, how you paid for medicine, tools, or a piece of land to call your own. Tally learned the trade early, mastering the art of the still, understanding the subtle science of fermentation and distillation under the dark Appalachian night. He was a big man, powerfully built from a life of hard labor. People knew him as strong, quiet, and fiercely protective of his own. He worked his still, provided for his family, and lived by the mountain code. In these early days, he was just a distiller, respected for the quality of his product. He was part of a community of others just like him, men who saw the federal government's whiskey tax not as a law to be obeyed, but as an intrusion by a foreign power trying to steal the bread from their tables. The conflict wasn't just about money, it was about pride and independence. The people of these mountains had always taken care of themselves. They built their own homes, grew their own food, and settled their own disputes. The arrival of federal marshals, the revenuers, was seen as a declaration of war on their entire way of life. These outsiders didn't understand the mountains or the people who lived in them. They saw moonshiners as simple criminals, not as farmers and family men trying to survive. And in this simmering tension, the seeds of Tally Hall's future were sown. He wasn't just making whiskey, he was making a stand. Every barrel he sold was an act of defiance. But this quiet rebellion couldn't last forever. The government was determined to enforce its laws, and men like Tally were just as determined to resist. The calm of the mountains was about to be shattered by the crack of rifles, and a simple moonshiner named Tally Hall would soon be forced to become something far more dangerous to survive. The world was coming for him, and it would learn that he would not be taken easily. The law came for Tally Hall not with a polite knock, but with the splintering of wood and the cold gleam of rifle barrels. It happened on a misty morning, deep in a holler where the smell of sour mash hung heavy in the air. Tally was working his still with his brother when two federal marshals, led by a man named Red Blevins, crashed through the undergrowth. They weren't there to talk, they were there to make an example. With a sneer, Blevins kicked over a barrel of fermenting corn, the lifeblood of the Hall family business spilling into the dirt. For a mountain man, this was more than the destruction of property. It was a profound insult, a strike against his pride and his ability to provide. Tali stood frozen for a moment, his massive hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word. According to the stories passed down, Marshal Blevins then raised his axe, not to the still itself, but to the worm, the delicate copper coil that was the heart of the operation. As the axe came down, something inside Tali Hall snapped. The quiet distiller was gone, and in his place stood something far more primal. What happened next became the first chapter of his legend. Tali didn't reach for a gun. He lunged forward, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He met the marshals not with bullets, but with bone and sinew. He broke one man's arm with a single brutal twist and sent the other flying with a blow to the chest that knocked the wind clean out of him. Red Blevins, the leader, found himself lifted off the ground by his throat, staring into eyes that held no mercy. Tali didn't kill him. He simply threw him down the hillside like a sack of grain, leaving him broken and humiliated. The marshals limped back to the town of Wise, carrying with them not just bruises and broken bones, but a story of a man who fought like a cornered bear. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about an unpaid tax. Tali Hall had assaulted federal officers. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was no longer just whispered among moonshiners. It was now spoken with fear and anger in the courthouse. He was officially a fugitive, a wanted man with a price on his head. Tali knew what this meant. There was no going back. He couldn't return to a quiet life. He had stood his ground, and now the full weight of the law was coming for him. But instead of running, he dug in. He gathered his brothers and his kin, men who believed in the same code he did. The forest that had been his workshop now became his fortress. The first drops of blood had been shed, not by Tali, but by the government's attempt to break him. And Tali Hall had answered in the only language he knew they would understand. The war had begun. With a price on his head, Tali Hall became the most hunted man in Wise County. But hunting him and catching him were two very different things. The mountains were his kingdom, and he moved through them like a ghost. This drove his rivals, other moonshiners whose business he had crushed with his own brand of violent enforcement, to a point of desperation. They decided to do what the law couldn't. They set a trap on the Pound Gap, a treacherous road that snaked through the mountains, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. They waited in the deep shadows as Tali rode alone, a silhouette against the rising moon. As he passed a narrow bend, the night erupted. A shotgun blast, fired from less than 20 feet away, struck him full in the head and upper body. The sound echoed through the holler, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. Tali's horse shrieked and crumpled to the ground, its legs tangled in a dying heap. The ambushers stepped out from their cover, rifles ready, expecting to see a body. But Tali Hall was still standing. He swayed on his feet, stunned by the impact, but he did not fall. The men watched in frozen disbelief as he slowly raised a hand to his face. There was a strange, gravelly sound, and then he spat something dark onto a broadleaf plant on the roadside. He did it again and again. The moonlight caught the objects, and the attackers felt a cold dread creep up their spines. They were lead pellets. Buckshot. He was spitting the bullets out of his own flesh. It was in this moment that the man died, and the legend was born. The attackers weren't looking at a moonshiner anymore. They were looking at something torn from the pages of a dark folk tale, a creature the mountains themselves had made. He took a step towards them, his face a mask of cold fury. One of the men, shaking with fear, raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet slammed into Tali's chest with a sickening thud, a sound like a hammer hitting stone. It barely staggered him. The sounds that followed were not of gunfire. They were the sounds of snapping wood as Tali ripped a rifle from one man's hands and broke it over his knee like a twig. They were the dull, heavy thuds of fists meeting flesh, followed by choked-off cries of pain. He didn't use a gun. He didn't need to. He moved among them like a storm, and when the terrible, frantic noise was over, only silence remained. He left the men broken and scattered on that lonely road, a living testament to his unnatural resilience. From that night on, he was no longer just Tally Hall. He was Iron Jaws Hall. The story spread like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers from one holler to the next. They said he was protected by a witch, that he had made a pact with the devil. The truth, doctors would speculate many years later, may have been a rare medical condition called Paget's disease, which causes bones to become abnormally thick and dense, essentially creating a form of natural armor. But in the dark woods of Wise County, no one cared about a medical diagnosis. The only truth that mattered was the one they saw with their own eyes and heard in the terrified tales of the survivors. Tally Hall was enchanted. He was bulletproof, and if you shot him, you had better pray you killed him with the first shot, because you would not get a second. The silence that fell over Pound Gap after the failed ambush was deeper and more terrifying than the roar of the shotgun that had started it. The broken men who dragged themselves back to civilization did not speak of a botched attack. They spoke of a nightmare. They told a story not of a fight, but of an encounter with something inhuman, something that ate lead and paid it back with crushing force. Their words, laced with genuine terror, were far more potent than any rumor. The legend of Iron Jaws Hall was no longer a whispered bit of folklore. It was now a sworn testimony, sealed in fear. Tally Hall himself seemed to understand the power of what had happened. He didn't retreat deeper into the mountains. Instead, he did the opposite. He became more visible, more brazen. He knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any rifle. His reputation preceded him, a silent, invisible guard that cleared his path. Other moonshiners, men who had once been his rivals, now fell in line. They either paid him a tribute to operate, a tax of their own, or they got out of the business entirely. To defy Tally was to challenge a man who bullets supposedly couldn't harm. No one was willing to take that chance. The authorities were now faced with an impossible situation. The reward for Tally's capture was increased, becoming a small fortune for the time. But money meant nothing against superstition. Deputies who were brave enough to face a dozen armed men would hesitate at the thought of confronting Tally Hall alone. Informants dried up, their fear of the law replaced by a much more primal fear of Iron Jaws. The manhunt, once an active pursuit, became a cold case file gathering dust on a shelf. They were hunting a ghost who was very much alive, a man who ruled a shadow empire from the heart of their jurisdiction. The community became a landscape of fear and fascination. On one hand, Tally was a boogeyman. People would lock their doors a little tighter at night, and his name was used to frighten misbehaving children. He was the embodiment of the violence and lawlessness that festered in the deep woods. But on the other hand, a quiet, grudging respect grew for him in some corners. He was a mountain man, one of their own, who was single-handedly defying the federal government and winning. He was a symbol, however dark, of Appalachian grit and refusal to bow down. The ashes of that ambush on Pound Gap were not from a fire, but from the smouldering ruin of Tally Hall's mortality. What was left was a silence born of pure dread. He had become the undisputed king of the Wise County underworld, not just a criminal, but a living legend whose power was rooted in the belief that he could not be killed by ordinary means. The law was powerless, his rivals were terrified, and Tally Iron Jaws Hall walked the mountains not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. Tally Iron Jaws Hall never stood trial in a courthouse. He was never made to sit on a hard wooden bench and listen to lawyers argue over his fate. The law of men, with its warrants, judges, and juries, proved utterly powerless against him. His trial was a rolling, years-long affair, held in the dark hollows and on the treacherous mountain roads. The prosecuting attorneys were the bounty hunters and federal marshals who came for him, and the evidence they presented was the buckshot and rifle slugs they fired his way. The bounty on his head grew to be a legendary sum, drawing daring men from neighboring states. They came with new rifles and hardened resolve, dreaming of the fame and fortune that would come from bringing in Iron Jaw's haul. They formed posses, laid intricate traps, and combed the mountains, convinced they would succeed where others had failed. They were, in effect, a traveling court, come to Wise County to deliver a sentence. But Taylor Hall was his own defense attorney, and his arguments were brutally effective. One by one, the posses were outsmarted, the traps were sidestepped, and the bounty hunters were met with a terrifying response. Some were found beaten near to death, left as a warning on the side of a road. Others simply vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. The verdict in each of these violent encounters was the same. Taylor Hall walked away. He was judged by the laws of survival, and in that court he was consistently found innocent by virtue of being the last man standing. This was not justice, it was dominance. Taylor had replaced the law of the land with his own law of fear. But the justice of the mountains is a patient, cruel thing. For every man he intimidated, he created an enemy. For every family he terrorized, he sowed the seeds of a future reckoning. His invincibility had made him arrogant, and he had forgotten the most fundamental rule of his world. There is always someone tougher, someone more desperate, or someone with a better aim. The final trial came without warning. A lawman, some say a deputy named Doc Swindle, decided the only way to stop a legend was to meet it head-on. He didn't come with a warrant. He came with a rifle and a resolve as hard as the mountain stone. He hunted Taylor not as a lawman pursuing a criminal, but as a predator stalking its prey. He found him on a lonely path, and there was no talk, no chance to surrender. The air cracked with the sound of a single, well-aimed shot. This time, Iron Jaws fell. He hit the dirt, and this time he did not get back up. The bullet, they say, was special. Some claim it was silver, others that it was filled with mercury, designed to overcome whatever magic protected him. But whether it was magic or lead, the verdict was finally in. Taylor Hall was guilty, and the sentence was death. It was a verdict delivered not by a jury, but by a lone gunman, and it raises the ultimate question. Was this the law of men at last catching its fugitive? Or was it simply the brutal, unforgiving justice of the mountains finally claiming one of its own? Taylor Iron Jaws Hall was buried in a small, remote cemetery in Wise County, not far from the lands he once ruled. For years, his grave was marked only by a simple fieldstone, as if even in death, people were afraid to carve his name for fear of what it might conjure. Today, a more formal headstone stands, a silent testament to the man who was once a living terror. Local historians and descendants still visit, standing over the patch of earth that finally managed to hold him, and they wonder. The physical landscape has changed. Pound Gap is no longer a treacherous dirt track, but a paved highway, US Route 23, that carries thousands of cars a day. Commuters and truckers speed through the cut in the mountain, their minds on schedules and destinations, completely unaware that they are passing through the very spot where a man once stood and spat buckshot back at his would-be killers. But for those who know the story, a drive through the gap, especially as evening falls, feels different. The shadows seem deeper, and the wind whistling through the rocks sounds like a whisper from the past. The legend of Iron Jaws has outlived the man by more than a century. It survives in the oral traditions of Appalachia, a story told by grandparents to their grandchildren, a campfire tale that happens to be true. While modern science offers a plausible explanation in the form of Paget's disease, that dry medical term has none of the power or romance of the legend. In the mountains, the story of the enchanted moonshiner who couldn't be killed by bullets remains the preferred version. It speaks to a deeper truth about the region, a belief in the extraordinary, and a deep-seated suspicion of simple explanations. The name Hall still echoes through Wise County and the surrounding region. The descendants carry not just the name, but the complex legacy of their infamous ancestor. For some, it's a dark chapter best forgotten, a stain of violence on the family history. For others, it's a source of a strange, defiant pride, a reminder of an ancestor who refused to bow to anyone, who was a king in his own right, however brutal his reign. The story hasn't vanished. It's simply gone underground, living on in family Bibles and hushed conversations. The mountains remember everything, and the shadow of Tali Iron Jaws Hall is a long one. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the start of our journey. Was Tali Iron Jaws Hall truly enchanted by bullets? The logical mind points to science, to the rare bone disease that likely turned his skull and ribs into a natural, horrifying armor. And perhaps that is the simple, factual truth. But in the mountains, the truth is rarely simple. The real magic wasn't in his bones, it was in the power of belief. His legend became a weapon more potent than any gun, a shield more effective than any steel plate. The fear he created was so real, so absolute, that it may as well have been a genuine enchantment. This is a story that goes beyond a simple tale of a mountain outlaw. It is a raw and brutal lesson about the soul of Appalachia itself. It's a story about the fierce, untamable spirit of independence, but also a dark warning of what that spirit can become when it's stripped of its humanity. Tali Hall began as a man defending his way of life, a symbol of resistance against an outside world he didn't trust. But in his war against the law, he became a tyrant far more terrifying than any government agent, a monster who preyed on his own people. He is the ultimate Appalachian paradox, a folk hero and a villain forged in the same fire. The story of Iron Jaws teaches us that some legends are born not from fantasy, but from a truth so strange it has to be seen to be believed. He was a man of flesh and blood, but he became something more, an idea, a nightmare, a force of nature. Force. He walked the earth for a time, a king in a kingdom of shadows and fear, until the mountains that created him finally took him back. His name is now a whisper on the wind, a reminder that the old, wild magic of these hills has not entirely faded.